Hello there, and welcome to History for Lunatics. I'm glad you're here tonight. Find a comfortable place. Let your shoulders loosen a little. You may be sitting in bed, resting on a couch, working a late shift, or listening through headphones while the rest of the house becomes quiet. Wherever you are, you do not need to prepare for a lesson or remember a list of dates. Tonight, we are going to take our time with one place and try to understand how it became what it is today. Before we begin, where are you listening from? Are you close to Philadelphia, somewhere else in the United States, or in a country where the name Kensington means nothing to you yet? You can leave your city or country in the comments. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. And if you find this kind of slow historical storytelling useful, you can subscribe and give the video a like. There is no need to interrupt what you are doing. You can decide later, after you have heard enough to know whether this is the kind of place you would like to return to. Tonight, we are going to Kensington. For many people, the name now produces an immediate picture. They imagine a stretch of Philadelphia streets beneath the elevated train. They imagine people standing with their bodies bent forward, outreach workers carrying naloxone, police vehicles moving slowly through intersections, and residents stepping around discarded syringes on their way to work or school. They may have seen short videos online, often recorded by visitors who arrive with cameras, point them at people in distress, and leave before learning the name of a single person who lives there. Those images are real, but they are not the whole neighbourhood. Kensington is not an empty stage on which an opioid crisis appeared. It is a place where families have lived for generations. Children still walk to school there. People still open shops in the morning, wait for buses, attend church, argue over parking spaces, carry groceries home, and check on elderly neighbours during bad weather. There are blocks where addiction is visible, blocks where it is less visible, and blocks where ordinary life continues beside conditions that would overwhelm many communities. This is important to understand from the beginning because Kensington is often described as though it were lost all at once. The word lost makes the process sound sudden. It suggests that a healthy neighbourhood went to sleep one evening and woke the next morning surrounded by fentanyl. That is not what happened. Neighbourhoods usually change slowly. A factory closes, a building is left empty, a family moves away, a tax base becomes smaller, a public service is reduced, a house deteriorates because its owner cannot afford repairs, a business closes because customers have less money, another business decides not to open. Drugs that were once sold quietly begin to be sold more openly. People who need treatment cannot find it, cannot afford it, or cannot remain in it. Each event may appear manageable when viewed alone. Over several decades, the events begin to reinforce one another. Fentanyl did not create every weakness in Kensington. It entered a neighbourhood that had already endured industrial decline, unemployment, population loss, housing abandonment, racial division, aggressive drug enforcement, underfunded services and earlier waves of addiction. It made existing damage more deadly. It shortened the amount of time available to reverse an overdose. It changed the economics of the illegal drug trade. It also reached beyond people who believed they were purchasing opioids, appearing in counterfeit pills and other street drugs whose users may not have known fentanyl was present. Illegally manufactured fentanyl is a synthetic opioid. It can be many times stronger than morphine, and because only a very small amount is needed to produce an effect, it is easy to transport and profitable to sell. It is also difficult to distribute in consistent doses outside a controlled pharmaceutical setting. 2 packets that look the same may not contain the same amount. A person may survive one and die after using the other. In Philadelphia, fentanyl became involved in the majority of fatal overdoses, while additional substances such as xylazine complicated the crisis further. Still, beginning the history of Kensington with fentanyl would be like beginning the history of a house with the fire that damaged it. We would see the flames, but we would not know who built the house, who lived in it, what work paid for it, or why some rooms were easier to save than others. So let us begin with the street. Imagine that you are standing near Kensington Avenue early in the morning. The elevated railway runs above part of the road, carried on steel columns that divide the view into repeated sections. When a train passes, conversation below must compete with the sound of wheels, brakes, and metal vibrating overhead. The train moves quickly. The people on the platform may look down for only a few seconds before the neighbourhood disappears behind them. At street level, the view is slower. Metal shutters cover some storefronts. Other businesses are preparing to open. Delivery trucks stop where they can. A resident sweeps the pavement outside a row house because this is still the front of someone's home. Workers from treatment programs and community organisations move through the area. A person may be sleeping beneath a blanket near a wall. Another may be searching for a relative. Someone carries coffee. Someone waits for medication. Someone calls emergency services. Someone is late for work. The neighbourhood does not pause to explain itself. If you arrived knowing only its recent reputation, you might assume the elevated train and the drug market were always the defining features of the area. They were not. Long before Kensington Avenue became internationally associated with addiction, the broader neighbourhood was known for work, not office work performed behind glass walls. Kensington was built around factories, mills, workshops, docks, rail lines, warehouses, foundries, and the homes of people whose labour kept those places operating. At different moments, residents made textiles, carpets, stockings, hats, machinery, tools, chemicals, ships, and many other products. The streets were shaped by the need to place workers near employment. The narrow row houses were not scenery designed for future tourists. They were practical housing built for a dense industrial population. By the beginning of the 20th century, Kensington contained one of the greatest concentrations of textile manufacturing in the world. In 1910, about 400 textile firms employed roughly 30,000 workers in the neighbourhood. Philadelphia's textile industry was unusually varied, producing carpets, hosiery, knit goods, wool products, upholstery materials, and many other items. Kensington stood at the centre of that system. Try to imagine the area before the sound of the elevated train became dominant. You would hear factory whistles, you would hear carts, machinery, horses, and later trucks. At shift changes, workers would fill the sidewalks. Some lived only a few blocks from the mill. The distance between home and employment was short because transportation cost money, time, and energy. A person who worked 10 or 12 hours around industrial machinery did not want a long journey home afterward. The air was not clean. Industrial Kensington was not a comfortable paradise later destroyed by modern problems. Coal smoke settled on buildings. Factories could be hot, loud, and dangerous. Textile work exposed people to dust and repetitive injury. Machinery caught fingers, hair, and loose clothing. Children worked in industrial settings during periods when child labour was common. Wages could be low, employers could cut hours, and a family might depend on several members earning money. Workers organised strikes because the neighbourhood's prosperity did not mean that wealth was evenly shared. Owners could become rich while employees lived close to the edge of poverty. Kensington had labour conflict because it had labour. Its crowded streets were signs of both economic activity and economic pressure. The neighbourhood also carried religious and ethnic tensions. Irish Catholic immigrants arrived in large numbers during the 19th century, joining Protestant residents and other immigrant groups in an area where employment, housing, politics, and religion could become sources of conflict. In 1844, nativist violence in Philadelphia led to deadly riots, with Kensington becoming one of the principal locations. Churches were attacked, homes were threatened, and people were killed. Long before modern news cameras arrived to document disorder, Kensington had already experienced occasions when national anxieties were concentrated into a few city blocks. This does not mean Kensington was always violent. It means the neighbourhood has never existed outside American history. Immigration, industrial capitalism, religious prejudice, labour organisation, urban growth, segregation, and public policy all passed through its streets. There were also ordinary evenings that left little evidence. A worker came home with lint caught in his clothing. A woman carried food from a market and calculated how far it needed to stretch. Children played close to the house because the street belonged to pedestrians more than it does now. Neighbours borrowed tools, shared news, and watched one another's children. Church bells divided the week into familiar intervals. A corner store allowed purchases on credit when a family was short of cash. People complained about landlords, wages, noise, heat, cold, and politics. They saved money when they could. They attended weddings and funerals. They hoped their children might find easier work. This was not a neighbourhood waiting to become a tragedy. It was a neighbourhood making Philadelphia. That distinction matters because the modern image of Kensington often removes the people who built it. The camera finds visible suffering because visible suffering attracts attention. It does not show the generations of machinists, loom operators, dyers, spinners, dock workers, shopkeepers, drivers, nurses, teachers, and homemakers whose lives gave the neighbourhood its routines. It also does not show how much identity can depend on employment. A factory does more than provide a paycheck. It determines when people wake, when streets become crowded, which stores receive customers, which houses remain occupied, and whether young adults believe they can build a life near their parents. It supports lunch counters, taverns, clothing shops, repair businesses, churches, clubs, and neighbourhood associations. It gives residents a shared schedule. Even the whistle announcing the beginning or end of a shift becomes part of local time. When factories close, the loss spreads beyond the factory gate. The employee loses income. The nearby store loses a customer. The landlord loses rent. The city loses tax revenue. A teenager sees fewer examples of stable work nearby. A building designed for industrial use becomes difficult to reuse. If many factories close over many years, vacant structures accumulate. Some are demolished. Others remain standing with broken windows, damaged roofs, and unpaid taxes. Empty buildings can become places for illegal activity, but they first became empty because legitimate activity disappeared. Philadelphia's textile industry declined sharply during the late 20th century as part of a wider process of deindustrialization. Production moved to other regions and other countries. New technologies reduced the number of workers required. Older urban factories became expensive to maintain. Companies closed, relocated, merged, or failed. Kensington, which had been built around dense industrial employment, was especially vulnerable because so much of its local economy depended on manufacturing. The people living through that change did not use the word deindustrialization every morning. They said the mill was cut in shifts. They said a supervisor had warned of layoffs. They said a building had been sold. They said their cousin was moving to New Jersey for work. They said a son could not find the kind of job his father once had. Academic language came later. The experience arrived one closure at a time. Consider what that means inside a household. A man who had worked at the same plant for 20 years might possess skill, discipline, and detailed knowledge that were valuable only to an industry no longer hiring. A woman who had balanced paid factory work with care for children or older relatives might lose both income and the social network formed around the workplace. A young person might be told to work hard while watching hard-working adults become unemployed. The problem was not that residents suddenly forgot how to work. The work left. Some families followed employment elsewhere. Others remained because their homes, relatives, churches and memories were in Kensington. Leaving a struggling neighbourhood requires resources. You need money for a deposit, transportation, moving costs and often higher rent. You may need access to credit. You may need confidence that a new job will last. People with the most options are usually able to leave first. Their departure reduces the neighbourhood's economic stability further, even though each family is making a reasonable decision for itself. This process occurred in many American industrial cities. Kensington's story is local, but it is not isolated. Detroit lost automobile jobs. Youngstown lost steel jobs. Baltimore lost manufacturing and port employment. Communities across Pennsylvania watched mines, mills, and plants close. In each place, unemployment was accompanied by changes in housing, health, family structure, and public confidence. Yet Kensington had another feature that would shape what came later: location. It sat within a major East Coast city. It had access to rail lines, highways, public transportation, abandoned buildings, and a large regional population. The elevated Market-Frankford line allowed people to travel into and out of the area without a car. Major roads connected Philadelphia to other cities. Vacant industrial properties and neglected spaces made illegal markets easier to conceal at first and easier to expand later. A drug market does not appear simply because a place is poor. Most poor neighbourhoods do not become nationally known centres of drug sales. Several conditions must come together: demand, supply routes, transportation, available selling locations, limited legitimate employment, corruption or uneven enforcement, and enough disorder that illegal trade can operate repeatedly. Kensington gradually acquired many of those conditions. Before fentanyl, there was heroin. Before the most visible heroin markets, there were other drugs and other forms of illegal trade. Before open-air sales became common, transactions occurred more quietly in bars, houses, vehicles, alleys, and abandoned buildings. The market changed as policing changed, as suppliers changed, and as customers learned where products could be purchased. Heroin had a long history in Philadelphia. Opioid dependence did not begin in the 21st century, and it did not begin among one racial or social group. In the 19th century, opium and morphine were used medically and sold with fewer restrictions than they would face later. Physicians prescribed opioids for pain, diarrhea, coughing, injuries, and other conditions. Morphine use expanded after the development of the hypodermic syringe. Heroin was introduced commercially at the end of the 19th century and was once marketed as a medical product before its risks were fully understood and legal controls tightened. By the later 20th century, heroin had become associated in public discussion with urban crime and marginalized communities. Government responses often emphasized punishment. When prescription opioid dependence expanded among a broader and often whiter population during the 1990s and 2000s, public language gradually shifted toward treatment and health, though punishment did not disappear. The contrast revealed that American attitudes toward drugs have always been shaped not only by the substance, but by who is believed to be using it and where that use occurs. Kensington experienced every version of that contradiction. Residents wanted dangerous dealing reduced. Families wanted relatives to receive treatment. Business owners wanted sidewalks that customers could use safely. People with addiction wanted relief from withdrawal, and in many cases wanted help without being treated as though they had stopped being human. Police were expected to enforce laws against a market that could relocate from one block to another. Hospitals stabilized people and released them into conditions that made recovery difficult. Treatment programs operated with limited capacity, while demand continued to grow. Then the drug supply became more dangerous. Between 1999 and 2010, prescription opioid sales in the United States nearly quadrupled. Some people developed dependence after receiving legal prescriptions, while others obtained pills through friends, relatives, fraudulent prescriptions, theft, or street sales. As controls tightened and pills became more expensive or difficult to obtain, some users shifted to heroin, which could be cheaper and easier to find. Philadelphia officials described this prescription-to-street transition as one part of the city's opioid history. Fentanyl entered that market as more than another drug. Because illegally manufactured fentanyl is powerful in very small quantities, suppliers can transport it more easily than heroin derived from poppies. It can be mixed into heroin, substituted for it, or pressed into counterfeit tablets. Many people who encountered fentanyl did not begin by intentionally seeking it. They purchased what they believed was heroin or a prescription pill. Over time, fentanyl became so common in the illegal opioid supply that avoiding it became increasingly difficult. Its speed changed what happened on the sidewalk. With some opioids, a person might show signs of overdose gradually enough for others to notice and respond. Fentanyl can suppress breathing quickly. A friend, stranger, outreach worker, or police officer may have only minutes to administer naloxone and call for help. Naloxone can reverse an opioid overdose, but sometimes multiple doses are needed, and the person can overdose again later if the opioid remains active after the naloxone wears off. This created a strange daily reality in Kensington. People who use drugs sometimes save the lives of other people who use drugs. Residents carry naloxone. Librarians, shopkeepers, outreach staff, transit employees, and family members learn to recognise slowed breathing and blue lips. A medication once known mainly to medical professionals becomes something ordinary people keep in bags and coat pockets. In 2018, Philadelphia formally declared the opioid crisis a public health emergency and created the Philadelphia Resilience Project, focusing heavily on Kensington. The city later established an overdose response unit, now organised as a broader division of overdose response, to coordinate prevention, treatment, community support, and public safety work. The official response itself reflects how large and persistent the problem became, but official declarations came after residents had already spent years living with the emergency. A mother did not need an executive order to tell her that the market had changed. She knew because she'd begun checking whether her son was breathing. A store owner knew because customers had stopped entering after dark. A child knew because the route to school included adults who appeared unconscious. A paramedic knew because the same blocks produced repeated overdose calls. A person using opioids knew because the product felt different. Withdrawal arrived differently, and familiar doses no longer behaved in familiar ways. This is where the title of our story requires care. The neighbourhood Philadelphia lost to fentanyl sounds as though Kensington no longer belongs to the city, or as though everyone inside it has already been defeated. Neither is true. Philadelphia did not lose every street, every family, or every possibility of repair. Kensington remains inhabited by people who object strongly when outsiders describe their home as though it were only a drug market. What Philadelphia lost was a version of Kensington that had already been weakened before fentanyl arrived. It lost factories, stable jobs, occupied buildings, population, and confidence over many years. Fentanyl then took lives at a speed that made older forms of neglect impossible to ignore. Even now, loss is not the only thing happening. People enter recovery. Outreach workers reverse overdoses. Residents organise cleanups and demand action from city government. Churches distribute meals. Nurses dress wounds. Families search for missing relatives. Block captains continue reporting illegal dumping and broken streetlights. Children grow up, graduate, and remember more about Kensington than what appeared in national headlines. There is anger too, and it deserves a place in the history. Residents are angry at dealers who profit from suffering. They're angry at visitors who film people without consent. They're angry at officials who announce plans but fail to maintain changes. Some are angry at harm reduction programs because they believe those programs attract drug use or make it easier to continue. Others are angry when harm reduction services are restricted because they have seen naloxone, sterile supplies, wound care and outreach keep people alive long enough to seek treatment. These disagreements are not simply arguments between compassionate people and uncaring people. Often they are disagreements between people carrying different kinds of harm. A resident raising children near an open-air market experiences one reality. A parent trying to keep an addicted child alive experiences another. A person sleeping outdoors while physically dependent on fentanyl experiences another. A nurse, police officer, business owner, teacher, and outreach worker may stand on the same corner and see different emergencies. history does not require us to pretend those differences are simple. It asks us to find out how the corner came to hold so many emergencies at once. To do that, we need to leave the cameras, the viral clips, the police barricades, and the present-day train behind for a while. We need to return to a period before the factories, before the row houses, before Kensington Avenue carried its current name, and before Philadelphia had expanded far enough to surround this ground. The streets beneath the elevated railway were once outside the young city. There were fields, waterways, paths, farms and communities whose history did not begin with William Penn. The land had already been known, used and travelled by the Lenape. European settlement would divide it into property, attach new names to it, and set in motion the growth of a district that would eventually become one of America's busiest industrial neighbourhoods. That earlier Kensington did not yet know the factory whistle, the closing mill, the heroin packet, or the fentanyl test strip. Its future was not visible. The first changes appeared modest. A land purchase, a road, a cluster of houses, a shipyard, a workshop, and people arriving because the edge of Philadelphia offered room to build. Long before anyone called this place Kensington, the land along the Delaware River already had names, paths, fishing places, planting grounds, and human memories. To understand that earlier landscape, it helps to remove the modern city one piece at a time. Begin with the elevated railway and take it away. Remove the traffic lights, the row houses, the warehouses, and the paved streets. Remove the factories and the church towers. Clear away the rail lines, brick sewers, stone curbs, and property fences. Even Philadelphia itself must disappear, because there was a time when the city had not yet been surveyed, and William Penn had not yet crossed the Atlantic to see the colony granted to him by the English crown. What remains is not empty wilderness. That phrase appears often in older accounts of American settlement, but it gives the wrong impression. The Delaware Valley was inhabited and managed by the Lenape, an indigenous people whose homelands extended through parts of what are now Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, and New York. They lived in communities connected by family relationships, trade, diplomacy, and seasonal movement. They farmed, hunted, gathered plants, caught fish, and travelled along paths that followed the practical shape of the land. The river was central to life in the region. It provided fish, transportation, drinking water, and access to other communities. Smaller streams crossed the land on their way toward the Delaware, creating wetlands and low areas where animals gathered and useful plants grew. Forests provided timber, nuts, berries, bark, fuel, and game. Open ground could be cultivated with corn, beans, and squash. The Lenape did not draw property lines in the same way European colonists would. That difference later produced confusion, manipulation, and conflict. Europeans often treated a land agreement as a permanent transfer, giving one person or family exclusive control over a defined area. Indigenous agreements could involve shared rights, political relationships, permission to use land, or continuing obligations between the people involved. When colonial officials placed those agreements into English legal documents, they turned a relationship into a deed and a landscape into property. The area near the future Kensington waterfront was associated with Shakamatson, a Lenape place name remembered in several spellings. The precise boundaries and meaning of the name have been debated, but the location became important in Philadelphia's public memory because of the traditional story that William Penn met Lenape leaders there beneath a large elm tree. Generations of Americans were taught that Penn arrived unarmed, exchanged promises of friendship with the Lenape, and established a peace that remained unbroken. Paintings later showed him standing beneath the elm while indigenous men sat or gathered nearby. The scene became one of Pennsylvania's most familiar founding images. The historical evidence is less certain. There is no surviving document that proves a single grand treaty occurred at Shakamatson in 1682, exactly as later artists presented it. Penn and his representatives did negotiate land purchases and political agreements with Lenape leaders, and a meeting may have taken place in the area. the famous story may preserve the memory of several meetings rather than one clearly documented ceremony. The location, date, and details cannot be established with confidence. That uncertainty does not make the story meaningless. It shows how a city chooses to remember its beginning. Pennsylvania promoted an image of peaceful settlement. Compared with some other English colonies, early Quaker diplomacy did produce periods of cooperation, and fewer immediate wars between colonists and indigenous communities. Penn instructed settlers to negotiate for land rather than simply seize it, and Lenape leaders entered agreements because trade and alliance could offer advantages in a changing region. Yet a peaceful purchase could still remove people from their land. European population increased, forests were cleared, farms expanded, animals essential to indigenous hunting became harder to find. Colonial livestock entered planted fields. New legal systems restricted how the Lenape could use places their families had known for generations. Diseases introduced through European contact caused severe population losses, even when no battle occurred. Later, colonial authorities also used dishonest or coercive land practices, including the notorious walking purchase of 1737, to claim much larger areas than Lenape leaders believed they had agreed to surrender. The story of the Delaware Valley was therefore not a simple choice between friendship and violence. Cooperation, trade, disease, pressure, negotiation, and displacement occurred together. By the time William Penn arrived in 1682, Europeans had already been active along the Delaware River for decades. Dutch traders had entered the region. Swedish colonists established settlements during the 17th century, creating a colony called New Sweden. The Dutch later took control, and the English took control after them. Each colonial power viewed the river as a route for commerce and territorial expansion. Penn received Pennsylvania from King Charles II in 1681 as payment for a debt owed to Penn's father. The grant gave him political authority over an enormous territory in North America, although the King's document did not account for the fact that indigenous people already lived there. Penn planned a colony that would provide religious toleration for Quakers and other groups, while also producing income through land sales and rents. Philadelphia was laid out between the Delaware and Schuylkill rivers. Penn imagined a spacious green town with broad streets, gardens and houses, separated enough to reduce the danger of fire and disease. Settlers did not follow his plan for long. Merchants wanted to remain close to the Delaware waterfront, where ships arrived and goods were unloaded. Buildings crowded together near the river, creating the dense commercial city Penn had hoped to avoid. The original city limits were small compared with modern Philadelphia. The land north of Vine Street lay outside the city in an area called the Northern Liberties. It was close enough to benefit from Philadelphia's growth, but beyond the tightly settled centre. Farms, country estates, workshops and small communities appeared there as population increased. The future Kensington stood within this outer zone. During the late 17th and early 18th centuries, the riverfront north of the city offered several advantages. Land was cheaper than in central Philadelphia. The Delaware provided transportation. Timber and other materials could be brought by water. Crafts that required large yards, noisy labour, smoke, or access to the river could operate without competing for the most expensive urban lots. Shipbuilding was especially well suited to the area. Philadelphia's economy depended on the river. Merchants needed vessels to carry flour, lumber, meat, tobacco and other goods along the coast and across the Atlantic. Local shipbuilders could obtain wood and iron from the surrounding region. Carpenters, blacksmiths, rope makers, sail makers, caulkers and labourers all participated in the trade. By 1720, at least a dozen shipyards operated along Philadelphia's waterfront and nearby stretches of the Delaware. As the central waterfront became crowded with docks, warehouses and commercial buildings, shipbuilders began moving upriver. The land that would become Kensington allowed them to spread out beside the water, launch vessels, store timber, and build homes near their work. A wooden sailing ship required more than an open patch of riverbank. Its keel had to be laid on a prepared slipway. Large timbers had to be selected, shaped, joined, and raised into position. Iron fittings had to be forged. Planks were bent and fastened to the frame. Gaps between boards were packed with fibre and sealed to keep out water. Masts, rigging, sails, cabins, storage spaces, and steering equipment all had to be completed before the vessel could enter service. The work demanded skill acquired through years of practice. A poorly shaped joint could weaken the hull. Bad caulking could allow leaks. Timber had to be judged for strength and curvature. A shipwright needed to understand both the materials in front of him and the forces the finished vessel would face at sea. Around the yards, other businesses appeared. Taverns served workers and sailors. Shops sold food, tools, clothing, and household goods. Small houses were built within walking distance. The riverfront gradually developed its own working community, still outside the formal city but tied closely to Philadelphia's commercial life. Into this landscape came Anthony Palmer. Palmer was born in England during the 17th century and spent part of his life in Barbados, an English colony whose economy depended heavily on sugar and enslaved labour. He later moved to Pennsylvania and became a merchant, landowner, and political figure. By the early 1730s, he had acquired an estate of roughly 190 acres in the Northern Liberties, north of Philadelphia. The property had been associated with the Fairman family and became known as the Fairman Estate. Palmer divided sections of it into smaller lots and sold or leased them to settlers. This process created the community that would receive the name Kensington. Why Kensington? Palmer chose the name from Kensington in London, a place associated with royal residence and growing prestige. The borrowed name gave the settlement a connection to England, and may have made the development sound more established than it actually was. Naming a new place after an older one was common in the colonies. It allowed settlers to carry familiar geography across the Atlantic, even when the new landscape looked nothing like the old. The name must have sounded ambitious beside the working riverfront. This was not London's Kensington Palace. There were no royal gardens, elaborate townhouses, or fashionable promenades. The Philadelphia settlement consisted of modest lots, workshops, houses, paths, and river-based trades. Many early residents were fishermen, artisans, and shipbuilders rather than wealthy landowners. Palmer encouraged development because selling land could produce income, but the settlement also benefited from pressures inside Philadelphia. Shipyards needed more space. Workers needed affordable housing. German immigrants and other newcomers needed places where they could establish households and businesses. The river offered employment and food. Fishing became especially important. The Delaware once supported enormous seasonal runs of shad. Each spring, the fish moved upriver in large numbers. Families and fishing crews used nets to capture them, sometimes working through the night when conditions were right. Fresh shad could be eaten locally, while salted or preserved fish could be stored and sold. The fishing industry became so closely associated with the old Kensington riverfront that part of the area eventually became known as Fishtown. The boundary between the names changed over time. The original Kensington settlement included land that many modern residents would now identify as Fishtown. As the city expanded, the name Kensington spread farther north and west, while the old riverside section developed its separate neighbourhood identity. Early maps did not display the neat neighbourhood borders people expect today. Local names emerged gradually from roads, churches, estates, industries, and common usage. One person might describe a location as Kensington, while another referred to the Northern Liberties or to a nearby creek, road, or landing. The streets also did not yet form the uninterrupted grid seen today. Some followed older paths, others were laid out between property lines. Roads became muddy during rain and deeply rutted from carts. Travel after dark was difficult. The river remained the easiest route for moving heavy goods, and boats connected the settlement with central Philadelphia and communities farther north and across the Delaware. A household in early Kensington might combine several kinds of work. A man employed in a shipyard could also fish seasonally. His wife might sell food, take in washing, keep a small shop, sew, care for boarders, or assist in family production. Children performed household labour and entered paid work young by modern standards. A family could grow vegetables, keep chickens, or maintain a pig if space allowed. Income rarely came from one protected occupation. The population included people who had crossed the Atlantic under very different conditions. Some arrived voluntarily seeking land or work. Some came as indentured servants, obligated to labour for a fixed number of years in exchange for passage. Others were enslaved. Slavery existed in colonial Pennsylvania, including Philadelphia and the surrounding townships. Quaker opposition to slavery developed gradually and unevenly. It was not the position of every early Quaker settler. Merchants, officials, craftsmen and farmers owned enslaved Africans and people of African descent. Philadelphia's growth was also connected to Atlantic trade, involving slave societies in the Caribbean and elsewhere. Anthony Palmer's years in Barbados connected him to one of the most brutal plantation economies in the English Atlantic. Sugar fortunes depended on the forced labour of enslaved Africans under conditions that produced extremely high death rates. Surviving records do not allow every part of Palmer's personal economic life to be reconstructed easily, but the route from England to Barbados to Pennsylvania was part of a colonial world in which land, trade and slavery were closely linked. This broader setting matters because early Kensington was never isolated from global history. The timber shape beside the Delaware could become part of a vessel sailing to the Caribbean. Flour loaded in Philadelphia might feed plantation colonies. Molasses and sugar produced by enslaved labour could return north. Merchants financed voyages, shipbuilders constructed the vessels, sailors carried the goods, and working neighbourhoods supplied the labour. A small settlement on the edge of Philadelphia was already tied to distant ports. Palmer himself became prominent in Pennsylvania politics. He served on the provincial council and briefly acted as governor of the colony in the late 1740s. Yet his lasting local importance came less from his time in government than from dividing and naming the land. He also set aside ground for public use. Palmer Cemetery, originally associated with the Kensington burial ground, dates to the settlement's early period. In an age before large municipal cemeteries, burial grounds were usually connected to churches, families, or local communities. The cemetery provided a place where residents could bury relatives near their homes. Death was familiar in the 18th century. Infant mortality was high. Infectious diseases spread quickly. Accidents occurred on the river and in workshops. Medical treatment was limited, and even an injury that appeared minor could become fatal through infection. A local burial ground was therefore not an occasional convenience. It was part of the practical structure of a settlement. Palmer died in 1749. By then, Kensington had a name, residents, businesses, and an emerging identity. It remained separate from the official city of Philadelphia, but the distance between them was shrinking in practical terms. Roads carried goods south. Boats moved along the river. Workers travelled between the settlement and the city. Philadelphia's demand for ships, fish, firewood, food and labour pulled Kensington closer. The community did not grow according to a single plan. One shipyard expanded, another house was built. A tavern opened where workers gathered. A family divided a lot between children. A fisherman stored nets near the river. A craftsman added a workshop behind his home. Paths became roads, and roads acquired rows of buildings. Growth came from thousands of small decisions rather than one grand design. By the middle of the 18th century, Philadelphia had become one of the largest and most important cities in British North America. Its port handled a busy trade. Its printers produced newspapers, pamphlets, and books. Its merchants accumulated wealth. Immigrants continued to arrive. The surrounding districts absorbed industries and people who could no longer fit comfortably inside the old city limits. Kensington benefited from that expansion, but growth brought pressure. Riverfront land became more valuable. Shipyards required increasing amounts of space and capital. Fishing grounds were affected by construction and heavier river traffic. Houses stood closer together. Residents depended more heavily on wage labour and commercial markets. The settlement was beginning to change from a semi-rural community of scattered trades into a dense working district. Nothing about this development made the later industrial city inevitable. A war, a change in trade, a failed business, or a shift in transportation could have sent the area in another direction. Yet the foundations were in place. There was access to the Delaware. There were skilled workers. There were affordable lots. There were connections to Philadelphia's merchants. There was a population accustomed to making a living through manual trades. Most importantly, there was room to build. The American Revolution would soon disrupt the river economy. British troops would occupy Philadelphia. Shipyards would face destruction, closure, and military demand. Independence would later open new opportunities while creating new uncertainties. Through those changes, Kensington's waterfront community would survive and expand. Its residents still would not recognise the neighbourhood that later generations inherited. They knew a place of boats, timber, mud, nets, smoke, animals, workshops, and modest houses. They lived beside a river that was both workplace and road. The land behind them had not yet filled with enormous mills. The great textile factories were still decades away. The rows of workers' houses that would cover whole sections of the district had not been built. But the habits that shaped industrial Kensington were already forming. People lived close to work. Families depended on several incomes. Local businesses served labourers. Immigration supplied workers and changed the neighbourhood's culture. Economic opportunity existed beside danger and insecurity. Prosperity depended on industries that individual residents could not control. As Philadelphia entered the 19th century, the scale of those industries began to grow. Workshops became larger. Machinery changed production. Canals and railroads altered transportation. Textile manufacturers discovered that the same neighbourhood, which had supplied shipbuilders and fishermen, could also supply thousands of factory workers. The quiet edge of the colonial city was about to become one of the busiest manufacturing districts in the United States. By the opening decades of the 19th century, the settlement north of Old Philadelphia was no longer defined mainly by fishing boats and wooden ships. The river remained important, and shipbuilding continued along the Delaware, but the neighbourhood was beginning to fill with a different kind of activity. Small workshops appeared behind houses. Looms operated in upstairs rooms. Steam engines began to replace muscle and flowing water. Tall brick buildings rose beside streets that had once passed through open land. The change did not happen in a single year. There was no morning when residents stepped outside and discovered that Kensington had become an industrial neighbourhood. One employer enlarged a workshop. Another installed new machinery. A family that had woven cloth at home began sending its children to a mill. A field was divided into building lots. A row of houses appeared near a factory gate. More workers arrived, and then more businesses opened to serve them. Within a few generations, Kensington became one of the most concentrated manufacturing districts in the United States. Textiles formed the centre of that transformation. Philadelphia had produced cloth since the colonial period, but early spinning, weaving and knitting had usually taken place by hand in homes and small shops. The Industrial Revolution changed the scale and organisation of the work. Machines could spin more thread, operate wider looms, and produce fabric faster than an individual craft worker. Steam power allowed factories to run without depending on a fast-moving stream. Railroads made it easier to bring in raw materials and send finished products to distant markets. Kensington was well positioned for the new economy. It stood close to Philadelphia's merchants and port, but land was cheaper than it was in the crowded centre of the city. Workers could live beside the mills. Coal, wool, cotton, dyes, machinery and finished goods could move through a growing network of roads, rail lines, canals and docks. The neighbourhood did not develop around one enormous company. Philadelphia's textile system was different from the large, fully integrated mills associated with places such as Lowell, Massachusetts. Kensington contained hundreds of small and medium-sized firms, each specialising in part of the production process. One factory might spin fibres into yarn. Another might weave the yarn into cloth. A third dyed the fabric. A fourth finished, cut, or prepared it for sale. This division created a dense industrial network. A manufacturer did not always need to own every machine required to make a product. Work could move between nearby companies, sometimes passing through several buildings before it was complete. That flexibility encouraged specialisation and allowed smaller businesses to survive alongside major firms. It also meant that a slowdown in one part of the system could spread quickly through the neighbourhood. Carpet manufacturing became one of Kensington's best-known industries. In the 19th century, carpets were moving from luxury objects into more ordinary middle-class homes, hotels, offices, stores and public buildings. Demand increased as American cities expanded and household consumption grew. Kensington manufacturers produced many types of floor coverings, using both hand looms and power-driven machinery. The scale became remarkable. By 1882, the two Philadelphia wards covering much of Kensington contained 141 carpet and rug firms. Together, they employed more than 6,000 workers. Thousands of hand looms and more than 1,000 power looms operated across the wider Philadelphia region, consuming millions of pounds of wool and producing tens of millions of yards of carpet each year. A person walking through Kensington during this period would have known the textile industry through sound before seeing every mill. A hand loom produced a regular clacking as the shuttle moved across the threads, and the weaver pressed each new row into place. Power looms multiplied that sound until an entire factory floor seemed to shake with it. Belts ran overhead, transmitting movement from a central engine to rows of machines. Spindles turned, gears engaged. Carts rolled across wooden floors carrying yarn and unfinished fabric. Workers had to communicate through gestures or by moving close enough to be heard. The noise continued for hours, stopping only when machinery failed, power was interrupted, or the working day ended. The air carried loose fibre. Wool dust and cotton lint settled on hair, skin, clothing, window sills and machinery. Oil used to keep equipment moving added another smell. Dye works produced odours of their own. Coal smoke escaped from chimneys and mixed with smoke from household stoves. In warm weather, factory rooms became stifling. In winter, workers might still feel cold near walls and windows while machinery created heat in the centre of the room. These were not minor inconveniences. Breathing textile dust for years could damage the lungs. Constant noise harmed hearing. Repetitive movement injured hands, shoulders and backs. Unguarded machinery could catch clothing or crush fingers. Fires were a constant danger in buildings containing dry fibre, wooden floors, oil and open flames. The workday was long. 12-hour and 14-hour shifts were common in the early period of industrialisation, often 6 days each week. Wages remained low enough that several members of a household might need to work. Men, women and children all entered the mills. For an immigrant family arriving with a little money, this industrial world could appear both harsh and promising. A mill job did not require ownership of land. It did not always require fluent English. A newcomer with weaving experience from Britain, Ireland or Germany could find familiar work. Someone without a trade might learn a repetitive task quickly enough to begin earning wages. A child could contribute to the household income. A family could rent a small house near the factory and avoid the expense of travelling far to work. These opportunities helped attract thousands of newcomers. English textile workers settled in Kensington, in such numbers that parts of the neighbourhood became known as Little England. Many came from regions where weaving and spinning had long traditions. Some had worked as independent artisans before industrial machinery reduced the value of their skills. Others understood the new factory equipment and brought technical knowledge American manufacturers wanted. Irish immigrants arrived in especially large numbers during the 19th century. Some fled rural poverty and political exclusion. Many more came during and after the Great Famine of the 1840s, when potato crop failure and British policy contributed to mass starvation, disease and emigration. Philadelphia became one of the ports through which Irish families entered the United States, and Kensington offered cheap housing and industrial employment. Irish men worked in construction, transportation, factories, docks and skilled trades. Irish women entered textile mills, domestic service, garment work, laundries, and other poorly paid occupations. Children also worked when family income required it. The Irish became a major part of Kensington's textile workforce and neighbourhood life. Scottish weavers, German artisans, and immigrants from other parts of Europe added to the population. Each group brought religious practices, political loyalties, foods, accents, associations, and ideas about work. They did not blend immediately into one peaceful community. Employment created contact, but it also created competition. Workers competed for jobs, housing, and political influence. Employers sometimes used differences in language, religion, nationality, gender, or skill to divide the workforce. A factory owner could threaten to replace striking workers with newly arrived immigrants willing to accept lower wages. Skilled workers might defend their status against people trained to operate newer machines. Protestant residents feared the growing political strength of Irish Catholics. The resulting tensions could become violent. In 1844, Kensington became the centre of a major outbreak of nativist violence. Anti-immigrant Protestants claimed that Catholic influence threatened American institutions and the use of the Protestant Bible in public schools. Political meetings and rumours increased hostility. Fighting broke out between nativists and Irish Catholic residents. Homes and churches were attacked, buildings burned, and people killed. The riots were not separate from the neighbourhood's industrial growth. They occurred in a district where rapid immigration, crowded housing, religious distrust, unstable employment, and political competition had placed different groups close together. Kensington was becoming a workshop of the American economy, but the people inside that workshop did not receive equal protection or acceptance. Even after the immediate violence ended, religious and ethnic boundaries shaped daily life. A family's church could determine its school, charitable support, social activities, burial place, and political connections. Catholic parishes provided help to immigrants who faced discrimination elsewhere. Protestant organisations built their own institutions. Taverns, clubs, fire companies and neighbourhood associations often reflected ethnic loyalties. The factory, however, brought many of these residents into the same economic system. A mill owner needed workers regardless of their birthplace. A loom did not stop to ask whether the operator was Irish, English, German, Catholic, or Protestant. The machine required attention, speed, and obedience to the factory clock. In that sense, industrial employment imposed a shared discipline even where social divisions remained strong. Time itself changed. Earlier craft workers could often control the pace of their day. A handloom weaver working at home might begin early, pause for a meal, handle another household task, and continue into the evening. Earnings were uncertain, but some independence remained. Factory machinery operated according to a schedule set by the employer. The whistle announced when work began. Gates could close against late arrivals, breaks were limited. Workers could not easily slow the machine without reducing production. The clock, rather than daylight or personal judgment, governed the day. This discipline extended into the streets. Shift changes released large numbers of workers at the same hour. Shops adjusted their business around paydays. Families prepared meals according to mill schedules. Children learned when a parent would return by listening for the whistle. Rows of narrow brick houses spread around the factories to accommodate the growing population. The Philadelphia row house used land efficiently. Builders could place many homes along a single block by sharing sidewalls. The basic structure was relatively simple. A narrow front room, another room behind it, bedrooms above, and sometimes a small kitchen addition or yard at the rear. Size and quality varied. Some houses belonged to comfortable skilled workers or shopkeepers. Others were cramped, poorly ventilated, and occupied by several families or lodgers. For industrial workers, the most important advantage was location. A person could leave the front door and reach a factory within minutes. No automobile was needed. Streetcar fare could be avoided. Children and adults working at different nearby mills could return to the same household. The closeness of home and factory also meant there was little separation from industrial life. Chimney smoke entered windows, machinery vibrated through walls. Delivery wagons and railroad cars passed near houses. Factory bells and whistles marked the day. Fires, explosions, and labour disputes occurred within sight of family kitchens. The home was not always separate from production either. Philadelphia's textile and garment industries relied heavily on work, performed outside formal factories. Contractors delivered materials to households where women and children sewed, knitted, trimmed, or finished goods for payment by the piece. A front room or bedroom could become a workplace during the day and return to household use at night. Piecework allowed women to earn money while remaining responsible for children and domestic tasks, but the arrangement benefited employers most. The company did not need to provide space, heat, light, or constant supervision. Workers were paid only for completed items. When orders slowed, the work simply stopped. A household could spend many hours producing goods and still earn very little. Philadelphia's garment production remained decentralized, with small shops, home labor, and firms that hired only when orders were available. Children's labor was essential to this economy. Some children carried messages, cleaned machinery, tied broken threads, moved materials, or performed tasks requiring small hands. Others helped with piecework at home. They worked because their wages could determine whether a family paid rent or bought enough food. Factory owners often defended child labour by arguing that it taught discipline and useful habits. Parents sometimes accepted it because they had no realistic alternative. Reformers later described children exhausted by long hours, injured by machines, and denied education. It is easy to imagine every parent willingly sending a child into a mill because attitudes were different. The reality was usually more difficult. Many parents understood the danger. They also understood the landlord expected rent and the grocer could not extend credit forever. The American dream offered in Kensington was therefore a family project rather than an individual achievement. One adult wage was rarely enough. A father might work at a loom. A mother might take in sewing. An older daughter might enter a hosiery mill. A son might carry materials or begin an apprenticeship. A lodger might rent a bed and contribute to household expenses. The family combined several small incomes, reduced spending, and hoped to save. Sometimes the plan worked. A skilled worker could become a foreman. An artisan could open a small shop. A family might purchase its row house. An immigrant child might remain in school longer than the parents had. The next generation could enter clerical work, teaching, business, or a skilled profession. Kensington produced real upward mobility. It allowed people who arrived with little to establish homes, communities, and businesses. Churches, beneficial societies, unions, and savings organizations helped families survive illness, unemployment, and death. Property ownership gave some workers security that would have been difficult to achieve in Europe. Yet the promise was never guaranteed. Industrial employment followed cycles. Orders rose and fell. Financial panics caused factories to cut hours or close. A household that had saved money during several good years could lose it during a long period of unemployment. Injury could remove the main wage earner. Illness could spread through a crowded house. A widow with young children faced immediate danger of poverty. Manufacturers controlled many of the terms. They could lower piece rates, increase production demands, or introduce machines that reduced the need for skilled labour. Workers responded by organising. Kensington's handloom weavers were among those who resisted mechanisation. Independent weavers had invested years learning their trade. A power loom threatened not only their income but their identity as skilled workers. In the 1830s, a group of Kensington handloom weavers reportedly attempted to burn a Manayunk mill that had installed labour-saving machinery. Their action was destructive, but their fear was understandable. A machine that increased total production could still destroy the livelihood of the person it replaced. Strikes became part of neighbourhood life. Workers stopped production to resist wage cuts, demand shorter hours, or protest conditions. Employers brought in replacements, hired guards, sought police protection, or waited for hunger to force employees back. Strikers organised marches and meetings. Families supported one another when wages disappeared. Local businesses sometimes extended credit, although shopkeepers also had bills to pay. Women participated in labour actions as workers and family members. They walked picket lines, confronted replacement labour, organised relief, and pressured men who considered returning before a settlement. Their role was not always recorded fully, especially when newspapers and union officials treated male employment as the central story. The Civil War altered Kensington's factories again. Philadelphia manufacturers received military contracts for uniforms, blankets, tents, flags, equipment, and other supplies. Some firms prospered. William Horstman's company became known for military textiles, ornamental braids, flags, and uniform trimmings. Earlier in the century, Horstman had introduced the jacquard loom into American textile production, using punch-card technology to control complex woven patterns. His Kensington factory represented the combination of immigrant expertise and industrial machinery driving the neighbourhood's growth. The war also disrupted supplies of southern cotton. Manufacturers dependent on the crop faced uncertainty, while the conflict reminded northern industry that its raw materials had long been tied to enslaved labour. Cotton reached Philadelphia after being planted, tended and harvested by enslaved people in the South. Northern merchants financed trade, northern ships carried goods, northern mills turned cotton into cloth. Workers in Kensington did not own plantations, and many opposed slavery, but the industrial economy in which they worked was connected to it. After emancipation and the war's end, manufacturing expanded further. New machinery increased output. Railroads tied Philadelphia more closely to national markets. The city annexed surrounding districts in 1854, bringing Kensington formally inside a consolidated Philadelphia government. The annexation placed police, streets, taxation, and public services under a larger municipal system, though improvements did not arrive equally. Industrial neighbourhoods continued to struggle with sanitation, overcrowding, smoke, and inadequate infrastructure. Wealth generated in factories did not necessarily remain on the blocks where workers lived. By 1850, Philadelphia employed roughly 12,000 textile workers. By 1882, the number exceeded 60,000 across nearly 1,000 firms. Clothing and textiles together accounted for more than 40% of the city's paid workforce by 1880. Kensington stood at the centre of this production. The neighbourhood became a place where almost every street appeared connected to manufacturing. Large mills occupied entire blocks. Smaller factories stood beside houses. Dye works, machine shops, warehouses, stables, and railroad facilities filled the spaces between them. The Bromley family built a major textile business in Kensington, producing carpets and employing large numbers of workers. Other owners specialised in hosiery, woolens, knit goods, yarn, lace, upholstery fabric, and recycled wool. Recycled wool, often called shoddy, became an important product. Old wool fabric and scraps were torn apart, processed into fibre, mixed with new material, and woven again. The product could be cheaper and lower in quality than cloth made entirely from new wool, but it allowed manufacturers to turn waste into marketable goods. Nothing was discarded casually when it could enter production. Scraps moved through sorting rooms, dyes changed the appearance of reused fibre, steam, chemicals, and mechanical force gave old material another commercial life. The process created jobs while filling the air with additional dust. At the height of the industry, an observer standing in the tower of the Bromley Mill at 4th Street and Lehigh Avenue could see more textile mills than from any comparable point in another city, according to a 1912 account. By 1910, Kensington alone contained about 400 textile firms employing approximately 30,000 people. Those numbers are impressive, but they can make the neighbourhood sound like a machine rather than a place where people lived. Return to a single row house at the end of a working day. A woman enters with sore feet after standing near a spinning frame. Fine fibre clings to her dress. A man washes his hands in a basin, though the oil around his nails does not disappear completely. A teenage daughter arrives later because her mill required extra time to finish an order. A younger child has carried coal from the cellar and helped prepare food. Supper is simple and timed around whoever returns last. Conversation includes the price of bread, a worker injured at the factory, rumours of a wage cut, and news from relatives. Someone has heard another mill is hiring. Someone else says the owner prefers English weavers or Irish girls or workers willing to accept less. After the meal, there may still be paid work to complete at home. Fabric lies folded on a chair. Buttons need attaching. Seams need finishing. The household is both a place of rest and another part of the production system. Outside, the neighbourhood remains active. Taverns fill with workers. Union meetings begin. Church groups organise relief for a sick family. Shopkeepers close their shutters. Factory watchmen make rounds. Night shifts continue in buildings where orders cannot wait. The next morning, whistles call the neighbourhood back. This repeated routine created more than products. It created identity. People described themselves by trade, mill, parish, birthplace, union and block. Skills passed through families. A father taught a son to judge yarn or repair machinery. A mother showed a daughter how to complete piecework quickly without wasting material. Relatives helped newcomers obtain jobs. Employers recruited through ethnic networks because a trusted worker could bring brothers, cousins, or neighbours into the factory. Kensington became a place where the American dream was measured in practical things. A regular wage, a house, food in the cupboard, children who survived, and the possibility that the next generation might work fewer hours. It was never a dream of effortless wealth for most residents. It was the hope that labour would lead to stability. That hope kept people returning to dangerous factories and crowded streets. It encouraged them to build churches, unions, clubs, schools, and businesses. It also made industrial decline especially damaging when it eventually came. The neighbourhood had organised nearly every part of life around work. Housing, commerce, family schedules, and local pride depended on mills that appeared permanent because they had operated for generations. Before those factories began to disappear, the industrial system reached its most powerful and most contested period. Production records rose, owners accumulated fortunes, and Philadelphia promoted itself as a manufacturing centre without equal. At the same time, workers demanded safer conditions, shorter hours, better wages, and protection for children. In 1903, tens of thousands of Philadelphia textile workers went on strike. Among the people drawn to Kensington was the labour organiser Mary Harris Jones, better known as Mother Jones. She paid special attention to the children working in the mills, some of whom had damaged hands, missing fingers, bent backs, or bodies weakened by long hours. That summer, she gathered a group of young workers and their parents and began a march from Kensington toward New York. Their destination was President Theodore Roosevelt's home on Long Island. They carried signs and stopped in towns along the route, hoping to force the country to look at the children whose labour helped produce its carpets, stockings and cloth. Most of the marchers could not complete the journey. They lacked money, proper shoes, and time away from work. A smaller group reached Roosevelt's home but was not allowed to meet him. The immediate strike failed to deliver everything the workers wanted, and the children returned to an industrial neighbourhood that still depended on their wages. The march did not transform Kensington overnight. It did something slower. It carried the neighbourhood's working conditions beyond Philadelphia and placed them in front of a national audience. The mills were producing more goods than ever. They were also producing demands that the industrial promise be made more honest. Workers had been told that discipline, sacrifice and labour would earn security. They were beginning to ask what happened when a lifetime of labour left a person injured, poor or easily replaced. The answer would shape Kensington through the new century, as reform laws reduced some abuses, unions gained influence, immigration continued, and the neighbourhood's factories entered their final period of overwhelming strength. The factory whistles did not fall silent together. There was no single afternoon when every loom stopped, every gate closed, and every worker walked home knowing that Kensington's industrial age was over. The neighbourhood lost its factories in stages. A company reduced one shift. Another moved part of its production to New Jersey. A mill owner stopped replacing old machinery. A warehouse remained dark for several weeks, and then reopened with fewer employees. Rumours travelled through lunchrooms, taverns, churches and family kitchens, long before an official notice appeared on a factory door. For workers who had grown up believing the mills would always be there, the first signs could be easy to dismiss. Textile manufacturing had always risen and fallen with the economy. Orders slowed during recessions and returned when consumers began spending again. Employers shortened hours, lowered wages, and laid people off. But many factories had survived strikes, depressions, wars, and changes in fashion. A mill that had operated for 50 or 75 years seemed more permanent than any one owner or employee. Kensington streets had been built around that confidence. A row house stood close to a factory because the family inside expected employment to remain nearby. A corner shop depended on workers receiving regular pay. Churches, schools, banks, taverns, social clubs, and neighbourhood associations all drew support from the industrial population. Houses had value partly because a buyer could find work within walking distance. A skilled textile worker might change employers without leaving the neighbourhood, because dozens of firms needed similar experience. By the middle of the 20th century, that arrangement began to break down. Philadelphia's textile industry remained important through the Second World War. Factories produced cloth, uniforms, blankets, webbing, and other materials needed by the military. Wartime demand kept machines running and drew workers into jobs left open by men serving overseas. Women who had already formed a large part of the textile workforce took on additional responsibilities. African American workers, many of them part of the Great Migration from the South, also entered northern industries in greater numbers, though discrimination continued to limit which jobs they could obtain and how much they were paid. The end of the war brought a brief sense that industrial prosperity might continue. Returning veterans wanted houses, furniture, clothing, and consumer goods. Families that had postponed purchases during wartime rationing began spending. American factories faced less foreign competition because much of Europe and Asia had suffered extensive destruction. The advantage did not last. Factories in Philadelphia were often old. Many had been built in the 19th century for a system of production that depended on narrow streets, multi-storey buildings, steam power, and workers arriving on foot or by streetcar. Modern manufacturers increasingly preferred large, single-storey plants where materials could move easily between loading docks and assembly lines. Trucks required wide roads and large parking areas. New electrical systems and automated machinery could be expensive to install inside aging brick buildings. Other regions offered lower land prices, lower taxes, cheaper energy, and workforces that were less heavily unionised. Southern states actively recruited northern manufacturers. Companies discovered that they could move production to places where wages were lower and labour regulations weaker. Later, international competition made relocation overseas even more attractive. Changing products caused additional trouble. Philadelphia firms that specialised in wool carpets, silk hosiery, or other traditional goods faced competition from synthetic materials. Nylon altered the hosiery business. Synthetic carpet fibres reduced demand for some wool products. Companies that could not afford new equipment or adapt their production closed. Garment firms had already begun moving work to so-called runaway shops in other parts of Pennsylvania, New Jersey and the South before the Second World War, often seeking lower wages and weaker unions. For a factory owner, relocation could be presented as a financial calculation. For a worker, it meant the disappearance of a future. Imagine a man who had entered a Kensington mill as a teenager. He learned to maintain machines that few people outside the textile industry understood. He knew the sound made by a damaged bearing and the slight change in vibration that warned a belt was slipping. His hands carried scars from years of repairs. By the time he reached middle age, his knowledge was considerable, but it was tied to a shrinking industry. When the mill closed, he did not become unskilled. The economy stopped paying for the skill he possessed. He could search for work in another factory, but every closure sent more experienced applicants toward fewer available jobs. He might accept lower wages, travel farther, or enter an occupation where his years of knowledge gave him no advantage. If he was older, employers could assume he would be difficult to retrain or expensive to insure. Pride became another obstacle. A person who had supported a household through skilled industrial work could find it difficult to accept temporary or poorly paid service employment. Women encountered the same losses, though their industrial careers were often described as secondary to those of men. Many Kensington women had worked in textile and garment production for years, while also managing households. They operated looms, inspected cloth, spun yarn, packed products, sewed garments, and completed piecework at home. When factories closed, their wages disappeared from family budgets, even if newspapers described the unemployed male worker as the central victim. The effects entered the household immediately. A family delayed buying shoes. A doctor's appointment was postponed. Repairs to the roof waited another season. A young adult remained at home because there was no money for an apartment. A parent borrowed from relatives or asked a neighbourhood store for credit. Savings intended for retirement were used to pay current expenses. Unemployment insurance could provide temporary relief, but it could not replace a permanent industrial economy. Job training programs promised new skills, although the new jobs were not always nearby or available in sufficient numbers. The expanding sectors of Philadelphia's economy increasingly included hospitals, universities, government offices, finance, and professional services. These employers often required formal education or credentials that displaced mill workers did not possess. A hospital might be hiring, but that did not mean a 50-year-old loom operator could become a nurse. Geography made the problem worse. Many new jobs developed outside the old industrial neighbourhoods or beyond the city limits. Suburban offices, warehouses, and factories were designed around automobile access. Kensington residents who had spent their lives walking to work or using public transportation could not easily reach them. Buying and maintaining a car required money at the moment household income had fallen. Some manufacturers moved only a few miles into surrounding counties or South Jersey, but even a short distance could place a job beyond the practical reach of a worker without reliable transportation. Scores of textile companies transferred operations from Philadelphia into nearby suburban areas during the post-war decades. From the perspective of a regional economy, the business had survived. From the perspective of a Kensington block, it had vanished. The neighbourhood also lost one of its most recognisable employers when the John B. Stetson Company closed its Kensington hat factory in 1971. Stetson had produced hats in Philadelphia for more than a century and had employed thousands at its peak. Changing fashion reduced demand, while broader economic pressures pushed the company away from the city. Its closure joined dozens of others and demonstrated that even a famous manufacturer with a nationally known product could leave. A closed factory remained present after its workers were gone. The building might cover an entire block. Its walls still rose over surrounding houses. The loading doors remained. The company name could still be visible in faded paint or carved stone. For a time, residents expected another manufacturer to arrive. Some buildings were purchased and reused. Others became warehouses or were divided among smaller businesses. Many stood empty because their size, condition and location made redevelopment expensive. Roofs began to leak. Broken windows allowed rain and animals inside. Metal fixtures were stolen and sold for scrap. Fires damaged wooden floors. Unpaid taxes accumulated. An active mill had provided lighting, maintenance, security, and hundreds of eyes watching the street. An abandoned mill created long walls with no customers, workers, or residents. Vacant industrial properties could become dumping grounds, hiding places, or locations for illegal businesses. Their physical presence reminded residents every day that investment had left. The surrounding houses lost value as employment disappeared. For many Kensington families, a row house was the largest asset they owned. They had paid mortgages from weekly wages and expected the property to provide security. When factories closed, fewer people wanted to move into the area. Buyers with choices looked toward neighbourhoods with growing employment, newer homes, more open space, and easier automobile access. A homeowner who wanted to follow jobs elsewhere faced a trap. The house might not sell for enough money to finance a move. Even if a buyer appeared, the low sale price could erase years of savings. Workers remained in Kensington not simply because they resisted change, but because the collapse of the local housing market made departure difficult. Researchers studying Philadelphia's deindustrialization have identified Kensington as a clear example of this process. Plant closures reduced housing values, which prevented some displaced workers from selling their homes and relocating toward better employment. Federal housing policy had already weakened older industrial neighbourhoods before the largest wave of factory closures. During the 1930s, government-backed appraisal systems graded city neighbourhoods according to what officials considered lending risk. Areas with ageing housing, nearby factories, immigrant populations or black residents were often given the lowest grades. Maps coloured many of these neighbourhoods red, discouraging mortgage lending and investment. The practice later became known as redlining. In Philadelphia, the closeness of homes and factories made many working-class districts appear undesirable to appraisers. The same arrangement that had allowed generations of residents to live near work was treated as a financial defect. Race and ethnicity also shaped the grades. Federal underwriting standards openly encouraged racial separation and warned against lending where the racial character of a neighbourhood might change. Banks and other lenders issued fewer mortgages in areas considered risky. Homeowners had difficulty borrowing money for repairs. Potential buyers could not obtain affordable financing. Buildings deteriorated, not always because owners were careless, but because the credit needed to replace a roof, modernise plumbing, or repair a foundation was unavailable. Redlining did not produce every vacant house in Kensington, and the neighbourhood's racial and ethnic composition varied from section to section. Its larger effect was to tell private capital that older industrial communities were poor investments. When factories later closed, neighbourhoods already denied ordinary access to credit had fewer resources with which to respond. Meanwhile, federal policy made movement to the suburbs easier for many white families. Veterans used government-backed mortgages to purchase newer homes beyond the city. Highways and automobile ownership expanded the distance between home and work. Developers built large communities on former farmland. Suburban municipalities offered newer schools and lower density housing, though many used discriminatory policies, restrictive practices, or informal pressure to keep black families out. The movement was not purely an escape from racial change. Families sought larger homes, yards, newer facilities, and access to jobs. But race influenced who received mortgages, where houses were available, and how people judged urban neighbourhoods. When black and Puerto Rican residents moved into parts of North and Lower Northeast Philadelphia, some white families interpreted the change as a warning that property values would fall. Their departure helped produce the decline they feared. The process became known as white flight, although the phrase can hide the public decisions that made it possible. Roads, mortgage insurance, zoning, school boundaries, lending practices, and infrastructure spending supported suburban growth while older urban neighbourhoods lost population and investment. Kensington's population changed with these movements. The neighbourhood had long been home to Irish, English, Scottish, German, Polish, and other European immigrant communities. During the 20th century, African Americans arriving from the South and Puerto Ricans moving to Philadelphia became part of the area's population and workforce. They entered a neighbourhood whose industrial base was already weakening and whose housing was often old. New residents were sometimes blamed for conditions created before they arrived. A Puerto Rican family might move into a block because discrimination and low income restricted its housing choices. The family then encountered overcrowded schools, declining services, and limited access to credit. Longtime residents could interpret the visible demographic change as the cause of decline, even though factory relocation, lending policy, and government investment had already altered the neighbourhood's prospects. Racial tension could become part of daily life. Children heard insults, families faced intimidation. Real estate agents encouraged panic selling by warning white homeowners that racial change would destroy property values. Investors purchased houses cheaply, divided them into smaller rental units, and performed minimal maintenance. These practices accelerated overcrowding and deterioration. Not every block followed the same path. Some remained stable for decades. Homeowners maintained their properties. Churches and neighbourhood groups continued serving residents. Local businesses adapted to new customers. Puerto Rican families opened shops and established organizations. African American families built their own community networks. White ethnic residents who stayed did not all oppose their new neighbors. Still, the overall direction was difficult to reverse because each loss reduced the neighborhood's ability to absorb the next one. When workers disappeared from a factory, lunch counters lost customers. When families moved, parish membership declined. A church with fewer members struggled to maintain its building or school. A bank closed a branch because deposits fell. A grocery store faced lower sales and greater security costs. Insurance became harder to obtain. Public facilities deteriorated as the city's tax base weakened. The city government was losing population and industrial revenue at the same time residents needed more support. Philadelphia's population peaked in 1950 at more than 2 million people, and then fell over the following decades. Manufacturing employment declined sharply across the city and region. The tax burden shifted toward remaining residents and businesses. Municipal officials faced aging infrastructure, rising poverty, abandoned property, and demands for services without the resources created by a healthy industrial economy. Public schools felt the strain. Buildings required repairs. Teachers worked with students whose families were dealing with unemployment, housing instability, and changing neighborhood conditions. Recreation centers and libraries served as important safe places, but competed for limited funding. Police responded to increasing property crime and disorder, often in ways that damaged trust with Black and Latino residents. The decline of formal employment encouraged an informal economy. People repaired cars in alleys, sold food from homes, collected scrap metal, performed unlicensed construction, or worked for cash. These activities kept households alive and should not be confused automatically with crime. They reflected the ability of residents to create income when traditional employers disappeared. Illegal markets also expanded. A neighbourhood with unemployment, vacant buildings, and weak commercial activity offered opportunities for stolen goods, gambling, prostitution, and drug sales. A young person who saw few legitimate jobs nearby could earn money more quickly by working at the edge of an illegal market. Most did not make that choice, but enough did for the market to become visible. The first people drawn into drug selling were not responding to fentanyl. Fentanyl was still far in the future. Heroin, cocaine, and other substances had their own histories in Philadelphia. Drug use existed during Kensington's industrial peak as well. Alcoholism, morphine dependence, and illegal narcotics were not inventions of deindustrialization. What changed was the environment around them. A stable factory job could impose a schedule and provide income, health coverage, union membership, and relationships with other workers. Its disappearance did not cause a person to use drugs, but it removed forms of stability that could protect individuals and families. Economic stress increased conflict, depression, illness, and hopelessness. Vacant properties gave sellers and users places to operate. Reduced commercial activity left fewer people watching the street. The legal response focused increasingly on policing. American drug policy during the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s became more punitive. Arrests, prosecution, and imprisonment were used to attack street markets. Residents often supported stronger enforcement because they were living with dealing, theft, and violence. At the same time, repeated arrests did not replace jobs, repair houses, or provide long-term treatment. Removing one seller created an opening for another when customer demand and economic incentives remained. Kensington was not yet the national symbol of an open-air opioid market that it would become. The foundations of that later market were being laid in ordinary ways: a vacant building here, an unemployed household there, a store closing, a bank leaving, a family unable to borrow for repairs, a young worker discovering that the mill where his grandfather had worked no longer existed. By the 1960s, most textile mills along the American Street corridor had already closed. City officials later used development programs and tax incentives in an effort to restore industrial activity, but they were attempting to rebuild an employment system that had taken more than a century to create and only a few decades to dismantle. Some former factories found new uses. New. Artists, small manufacturers, community organisations and housing developers eventually entered portions of old industrial Kensington. Certain areas closer to Centre City and the Delaware waterfront attracted investment. Former mills became apartments, studios, offices and restaurants. That redevelopment did not reach all residents equally. A converted factory could represent recovery from industrial decline while also producing higher rents. New businesses could bring jobs and safety while making long-time tenants fear displacement. Kensington was large enough for redevelopment and severe abandonment to exist only a short distance apart. In the sections where disinvestment remained deepest, the disappearance of work had altered the meaning of the neighbourhood. Older residents could still identify buildings by the companies that once occupied them. They remembered the whistle times, the workers crowding sidewalks, and the smell of production. Younger residents saw locked gates, empty lots, and ruins without knowing what had been made there. A child could pass a broken factory wall on the way to school, without realising that hundreds of people once entered it every morning. The building had become part of the background. So had unemployment, vacancy, and the belief that city officials appeared mainly when conditions became impossible to ignore. Kensington had not lost its residents or its capacity for community, but it had lost much of the economic structure that once held its daily life together. The next major change did not arrive through a factory gate. It came through hospitals, doctors' offices, pharmacies, medicine cabinets, and prescriptions written for pain. At first, it did not resemble the street drug trade that had taken root around abandoned buildings. It carried labels, dosage instructions, company names, and the authority of modern medicine. For many families, the path toward the next crisis began with a bottle that had been obtained legally. The bottle did not look dangerous. It was made of orange plastic, small enough to fit into a coat pocket, with a white cap and a printed label carrying the patient's name. The instructions came from a doctor, the tablets came from a pharmacy. There was no dealer standing beneath the elevated railway, no exchange in an abandoned building, and no reason for the person holding the bottle to believe that it belonged to the same history as heroin. For many Americans, the path into opioid dependence began in surroundings that appeared completely ordinary. A construction worker injured his back while lifting equipment. A woman developed persistent pain after surgery. A man with arthritis found that each year made his job more difficult. A teenager received medication after dental work. A veteran returned home with injuries that did not disappear when the wounds closed. A factory worker whose knees and shoulders had been damaged by years of repetitive labour wanted to remain employed. The pain was real. That fact must remain at the centre of the story because the prescription opioid crisis did not begin with millions of people inventing symptoms. It developed during a period when American medicine was being criticised, often correctly, for failing to treat pain seriously. Patients with cancer, surgical injuries, chronic illness, and severe trauma sometimes suffered because doctors feared prescribing strong medication. People were told to endure pain that could have been reduced. Families watched relatives spend their final months in unnecessary distress. During the 1980s and 1990s, doctors, patient advocates, professional organisations and regulators pushed medicine to respond more aggressively. Pain was increasingly described as an important clinical measure. In 1995, the American Pain Society promoted the idea of pain as a fifth vital sign, placing it beside temperature, pulse, breathing, and blood pressure as something that health professionals should assess routinely. Hospitals adopted numerical scales asking patients to rate pain from 0 to 10. Accreditation standards and institutional policies encouraged medical staff to document and treat it. The intention was not to create an addiction epidemic. The intention was to prevent suffering from being ignored. A patient who said that the pain was severe should not have been dismissed simply because a clinician could not see it. Pain is difficult to measure. A thermometer can display a temperature, but no instrument can show exactly what another person feels inside an injured back or damaged joint. The numerical scale gave patients a direct way to describe their condition. Problems developed when a complicated human experience was treated like a number that should always be reduced quickly. A nurse might ask for a pain score during each visit. A hospital might evaluate whether staff responded fast enough. Patient satisfaction became important to administrators. Doctors worked under time pressure and often had few resources for long-term pain treatment. Physical therapy could be expensive or difficult to arrange. Surgery was not always appropriate. Counselling, workplace changes, weight management, and other interventions required time and cooperation. A prescription could be written in minutes. Pharmaceutical companies entered this environment with products they presented as effective answers. OxyContin, an extended-release form of oxycodone manufactured by Purdue Pharma, entered the American market in 1996. The tablet was designed to release medication over many hours. The company and its representatives promoted it widely to physicians, including for forms of chronic pain that were not related to cancer. Sales representatives visited medical offices, distributed educational materials, sponsored events, and encouraged doctors to view extended-release opioids as manageable treatments for patients who needed continuing relief. Industry-supported messaging often minimized addiction risks and emphasized the possibility that patients could use opioids safely under medical supervision. Reviews of the epidemic have described how aggressive pharmaceutical promotion operated alongside the broader movement to treat pain more seriously. The medical profession did not receive one clear instruction from one source. Doctors encountered a mixture of legitimate concern about untreated pain, incomplete scientific evidence, professional pressure, patient expectations, and commercial marketing. Many prescribed opioids with the honest belief that they were improving lives. A patient might begin with a low dose. The medicine reduced pain and also created a sense of calm or well-being. For someone who had spent months unable to sleep or work comfortably, the relief could feel remarkable. The person returned to ordinary tasks and believed the problem had finally been controlled. The body, however, adapts to opioids. These drugs attach to receptors involved in pain, pleasure, and breathing. With repeated use, a person may develop tolerance, meaning that the same dose produces less effect. Physical dependence can follow. When the drug is stopped, the body reacts with withdrawal symptoms that can include sweating, vomiting, diarrhea, anxiety, muscle pain, insomnia, restlessness, and an overpowering urge to use the drug again. Physical dependence is not identical to addiction. A patient taking opioids exactly as prescribed can become physically dependent without developing the compulsive behavior associated with opioid use disorder. Yet dependence can create conditions in which stopping becomes extremely difficult. The city of Philadelphia explains that regular opioid use can produce tolerance and physical dependence, while withdrawal and craving can be treated with medications such as methadone or buprenorphine. Inside a medical office, these changes were not always recognized quickly. A patient reported that the medication no longer lasted as long. The dose increased. An injury that had been expected to heal became chronic. A prescription intended for several weeks continued for months or years. One doctor retired, and another inherited the patient. Medical records did not always move smoothly between offices. Monitoring systems were less developed than they would become later. Some patients used the medicine only as directed. Others took an extra tablet during a difficult day. A few discovered that crushing or altering an extended-release pill produced a faster effect. Tablets were shared with relatives, left in medicine cabinets, stolen or sold. The pills moved from the clinic into the household economy. A bottle prescribed to one person could become available to several. A teenager might take tablets without understanding their strength. A relative might borrow one for pain. Someone facing financial pressure might sell part of a prescription. Pills obtained legally entered an illegal market without changing their appearance. They still carried pharmaceutical markings. Their measured doses made them seem safer than powder purchased on the street. A person could identify the manufacturer and strength. That familiarity allowed many users to maintain a distinction between themselves and people who used heroin. "I take medicine," a person could say. "I do not use drugs." The distinction carried social meaning. Heroin had been associated for decades with urban poverty, crime, racial stereotypes, and moral failure. Prescription opioids belonged to doctors, pharmacies, surgery, insurance, and respectable medicine. People who would never have considered purchasing heroin could take oxycodone or hydrocodone without believing that they had crossed into the same world. The chemistry did not respect that boundary. Prescription painkillers and heroin act on many of the same opioid receptors. When a person dependent on pills could no longer obtain them, heroin could prevent withdrawal. It was often cheaper and, in places with established drug markets, easier to find. Between 1999 and 2010, sales of prescription opioids in the United States nearly quadrupled. The first major wave of the modern opioid overdose epidemic began with increased prescribing during the 1990s, followed by rising deaths involving prescription opioids from around 1999 onward. A second wave began around 2010 as heroin deaths increased rapidly. The movement from prescriptions to heroin did not follow one route. Some people lost access because a doctor recognized dangerous use and stopped prescribing. Others were discharged after violating a pain agreement. Insurance coverage changed. new regulations made prescriptions harder to obtain. Clinics closed. Tablets became expensive on the street. A person who had once paid a pharmacy copayment discovered that a day's supply now cost far more. The first attempt to purchase heroin could be driven less by a desire for excitement than by fear of withdrawal. Imagine waking before dawn with aching muscles, nausea, sweating, and anxiety. You know that swallowing a tablet will make the symptoms recede, but the bottle is empty. You cannot work in that condition. You cannot care for children comfortably. You have already called the doctor and been refused. Someone tells you that a small packet of heroin will do what the pill did. The decision may still feel impossible. Heroin belongs to a category you have avoided your entire life. You may remember warnings from school or relatives. You may know someone who died. Then another hour of withdrawal passes. The person who crosses that boundary does not necessarily begin by injecting. Heroin can be swallowed, smoked, or inhaled through the nose. That allows a new user to tell himself that he is not like the people he associates with needles. Over time, tolerance and cost can make injection more attractive because it delivers a stronger effect from a smaller amount. Each step can be explained as temporary, only until the prescription is renewed, only until the back improves, only until work begins again, only this weekend, only once. For Kensington, this national shift arrived in a neighbourhood where a heroin market already existed. The area's vacant industrial buildings, transportation routes, concentrated poverty, and long history of street-level drug sales allowed heroin to be obtained with relative ease. Buyers came from other Philadelphia neighbourhoods, surrounding counties, and eventually other states. Some arrived by car, others used the Market Frankford line, which carried passengers directly above Kensington Avenue. A person could leave a suburban home, travel into Philadelphia, buy heroin, and return without understanding much about the neighbourhood where the purchase occurred. To the buyer, Kensington was a destination. To the residents, it remained home. That difference shaped the crisis. Drug markets are often described as products of the neighbourhoods in which they operate, but customers create them too. Kensington's market did not survive only because local residents purchased drugs. Regional demand brought money into the area. People from places with greater wealth and fewer visible signs of disorder travelled to a poorer neighbourhood to obtain substances and then left the consequences concentrated behind them. Some buyers never returned home. They overdosed in cars, abandoned buildings, alleys, public bathrooms, or beneath the elevated train. Others remained because dependents had consumed their money, housing, and relationships. A trip intended to last an hour became days, weeks, or years. The prescription bottle and the street packet were connected by a national medical and commercial system, but their consequences became geographically unequal. A prescription could originate in a quiet medical office far from Kensington. The patient might develop dependence in a suburban bedroom. Once access to pills disappeared, the search for heroin brought the person into a neighbourhood already burdened by abandonment and poverty. Kensington became the visible location of a crisis that had begun in thousands of less visible places. Public understanding changed slowly. During earlier heroin epidemics, people who used drugs in poor Black and Latino communities were often described as criminals. Law enforcement dominated the response. Long prison sentences were justified as necessary protection. Treatment existed but remained limited, stigmatized, and difficult to access. As prescription opioid dependence spread among white, suburban, rural, and middle-class Americans, the language became more medical. News stories described sons, daughters, athletes, workers, and patients who had become addicted after injury. Families demanded treatment rather than punishment. The shift toward public health was necessary, but it exposed a double standard. Addiction had always been a health condition. including when the people suffering from it lived in neighbourhoods such as Kensington. Compassion became more politically available when the public face of opioid dependence changed. Doctors also faced a difficult correction. As overdose deaths increased, authorities tightened prescribing rules and created monitoring systems. Clinicians received new warnings about dosage and duration. Some reduced prescriptions carefully, working with patients to manage withdrawal and find alternative treatments. Others stopped abruptly. A patient who had taken opioids for years might be told that the prescription would not continue. The decision reduced the doctor's legal and professional risk, but it did not remove the patient's physical dependence. Without treatment, tapering or support, some turned to illegal pills or heroin. This does not mean that reducing excessive prescribing was wrong. Prescribing had reached dangerous levels, and long-term opioids were being used in situations where benefits did not clearly outweigh risks. The failure came when access to medication was restricted without building enough pain care and addiction treatment to receive the people affected. The country had spent years expanding the supply of pills. It could not reverse the damage simply by closing the bottle. Responsibility was distributed across many institutions, but it was not distributed equally. Pharmaceutical manufacturers chose how to market their products. Distributors decided how many pills to ship. Pharmacies filled prescriptions. Regulators monitored supply. Medical organizations created standards. Doctors made prescribing decisions. Insurance companies determined which treatments they would cover. Patients made choices within circumstances shaped by pain, information, and access. Purdue Pharma later admitted serious criminal conduct related to the marketing and distribution of its opioid products. In 2020, the company pleaded guilty to 3 felony offences. Among other admissions, Purdue acknowledged that it continued marketing opioids to more than 100 healthcare providers, whom it had reason to believe were diverting drugs, provided misleading information to the Drug Enforcement Administration, and made payments connected to increased prescribing of its products. Those admissions concerned conduct extending into the 2000s and 2010s, but by then the prescription opioid market had already changed the country. Dependence had entered families that had never encountered heroin. Large quantities of pills had circulated through legal and illegal channels. Medical culture had been altered. A generation of users had learned through prescription medicine that opioids could make physical and emotional pain disappear for several hours. The word pain covered more than injury. Kensington residents carried the pain of unemployment, unstable housing, family loss, violence, illness, and earlier addiction. People arriving from outside the neighbourhood carried their own. An opioid did not distinguish between pain caused by a damaged spine and pain caused by grief. It could quiet both temporarily. That temporary relief helped make the drugs difficult to abandon. A person might begin using after surgery and continue because the medicine also reduced anxiety. Someone with untreated trauma could discover that opioids created distance from memories. A worker facing eviction could experience several hours in which fear seemed less immediate. The drug did not solve any of these problems. It altered the person's response long enough to make repeated use understandable. By the early 2010s, Philadelphia was seeing the consequences of the transition from prescription opioids to heroin. The city's own account notes that prescription painkillers are chemically similar to heroin, and that some people who became physically dependent after receiving prescriptions moved towards street opioids when those prescriptions ended. Kensington's heroin market grew stronger because the customer base had expanded. Dealers adapted to demand. Brands stamped on small packets allowed sellers to distinguish their product. Buyers shared information about strength and availability. A location known for consistent sales attracted more customers, which attracted more sellers. The elevated train, highways, and nearby rail connections helped the market operate on a regional scale. Police arrests disrupted particular corners but rarely eliminated demand. Sellers moved a few blocks or changed methods. Vacant buildings offered indoor locations. Abandoned rail corridors and overgrown lots provided concealment. A neighbourhood weakened by decades of industrial loss became part of the distribution system for a crisis created far beyond its borders. By November 2016, Philadelphia officials projected that the city would experience approximately 840 drug overdose deaths that year, with opioids involved in about 80% of them. The expected death toll was nearly 3 times the number of homicides. The city announced a task force because the crisis had become too large to treat as a collection of isolated cases. At that point, fentanyl was already appearing. The heroin sold in Kensington had never been a regulated product. Its purity varied, and users could not know the exact dose. Fentanyl made that uncertainty far more dangerous. A synthetic opioid could be manufactured without growing poppies, transported in small quantities, and added to street products to increase strength. At first, many users did not request it. They wanted heroin. Dealers used fentanyl because it was powerful and economical. Some packets contained both. Others contained little or no heroin. A person accustomed to a certain quantity could purchase what appeared to be the same product and encounter a dose far stronger than expected. The prescription era had created and expanded opioid dependence. The heroin market had provided a substitute when the pills became inaccessible. Fentanyl was about to alter the supply itself. That change would affect more than overdose numbers. It would change how long the effects lasted, how often some people needed to purchase drugs, how quickly an overdose occurred, what outreach workers carried, what paramedics encountered, and what residents saw on the streets. It would make the old heroin market more deadly, while attracting national attention to a neighbourhood that had been absorbing the effects of American policy for generations. The orange bottle had not remained in the medicine cabinet. Its history had travelled through the clinic, the pharmacy, the household, and the illegal pill market. It had crossed the boundary into heroin and arrived beneath the elevated railway. What followed would no longer look like ordinary medicine, but it would still carry the decisions made during the years when strong opioids had been presented as a simple answer to pain. What arrived in Kensington did not announce itself as a new era. The powder looked much like the heroin already being sold. It could be placed in the same small packets, carried through the same streets, and purchased from the same corners. A person using it might not see a difference before the drug entered the body. There was no reliable colour, smell, or texture that allowed someone to identify fentanyl by sight. The difference appeared in what happened next. A dose that seemed familiar could stop a person's breathing with unusual speed. Someone who had used heroin for years and believed he understood his tolerance could collapse before putting away the packet. A person who had survived the same routine hundreds of times might not survive the next one. Friends learned to watch one another more closely. Outreach workers carried more naloxone. Paramedics returned repeatedly to the same blocks. The illegal opioid supply had changed, and the old experience of the people using it no longer provided the protection they thought it did. Fentanyl itself was not a new medicine. Pharmaceutical fentanyl had been used for decades in surgery and for severe pain, especially cancer pain. In controlled medical settings, clinicians knew the dose, monitored the patient, and had equipment available if breathing became dangerously slow. The fentanyl entering Kensington was different in origin and use. It was manufactured illegally, distributed without quality control, and mixed into a market where neither the buyer nor the street-level seller could always know the exact strength of what they were handling. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention describes fentanyl as a synthetic opioid that can be up to 50 times stronger than heroin and 100 times stronger than morphine. Most recent fentanyl-related harm in the United States has involved illegally manufactured fentanyl rather than medication given by doctors. Its strength alone does not explain why it transformed the drug market. The economics mattered. Heroin traditionally begins with poppies cultivated in particular climates. The plants must be grown, harvested, processed, transported across borders, and moved through several levels of distribution. Each stage takes space, time, labour, and risk. Fentanyl can be made in laboratories from chemical ingredients. A much smaller amount can produce a large number of street doses because the substance is so potent. That makes it easier to conceal and transport than an equivalent supply of heroin. For organisations selling illegal drugs, it offered a way to reduce dependence on agricultural production, while increasing the strength and profitability of the final product. The same qualities that appealed to suppliers made the drug dangerously unpredictable for users. When a medicine is manufactured legally, the active ingredient is distributed according to controlled standards. A tablet marked with a particular dose is expected to contain that dose. In an illegal mixture, fentanyl may not be spread evenly. One portion of a batch can contain much more than another. 2 packets prepared from what appears to be the same supply may produce very different effects. This became one of the central dangers of Kensington's new market. A person could use 1 packet and remain conscious, then purchase another bearing the same stamp and overdose. Familiarity with the seller, the packaging, or the neighbourhood could not guarantee consistency. The product was not being made under conditions designed to protect the customer. At first, fentanyl was often understood as an adulterant added to heroin. Some sellers used it to strengthen weak heroin or make a product appear more powerful. Some buyers did not know it was present. Philadelphia health officials later warned that fentanyl had also been found in counterfeit pills, cocaine, and crack, creating risk for people who did not consider themselves opioid users. The word contamination can make this process sound accidental. Sometimes cross-contamination may occur when different drugs are handled with the same equipment. In many cases, however, fentanyl is added deliberately because it changes the effect and economics of the product. The person purchasing the drug may still be unaware of it. For long-time heroin users, the arrival of fentanyl created a difficult adjustment. Some disliked its effects. Heroin generally lasted longer, while fentanyl could produce a shorter period of relief followed by the return of withdrawal. A person who once purchased drugs several times a day might need to seek them more frequently. The shorter cycle changed the rhythm of life on the street. More time was spent obtaining money, finding a seller, buying the drug, using it, recovering from the immediate effect and trying to avoid the next withdrawal. Sleep became irregular. Eating and basic hygiene were pushed aside. Appointments were missed because the body's demand for the drug had its own schedule. For people without stable housing, the cycle could become nearly continuous. The body was not simply seeking pleasure. Once physical dependence was established, much of the use was intended to prevent withdrawal. A person waking beneath the elevated railway might already be sweating, aching, nauseated and anxious. Obtaining the next dose could feel as urgent as finding water during extreme heat. This urgency gave the market unusual power. Kensington was already known as a place where heroin could be found reliably. Fentanyl increased the strength of that reputation. Buyers travelled from other neighbourhoods, suburbs and states because they believed the product would be available and potent. The Market-Frankfurt line made access easy. A person could step off a train, make a purchase, and intend to leave within minutes. Highways and regional roads brought people by car. The neighbourhood's abandoned industrial land, rail corridors, vacant houses, and neglected public spaces provided places where sales and use could occur away from direct supervision. Many visitors treated Kensington as though it were only a marketplace. Residents experienced something else. The transaction did not disappear when the buyer left. Packaging remained on sidewalks. Overdoses occurred outside homes and businesses. People experiencing withdrawal sought shelter in doorways. Dealers competed for territory. Emergency vehicles arrived at all hours. Children encountered scenes that adults struggled to explain. A person living on one of these blocks could support treatment and still demand that the drug market be removed from the front of the house. That distinction was often lost in public debate. Residents who opposed open-air drug use were sometimes portrayed as lacking compassion. Harm reduction advocates were sometimes portrayed as accepting permanent disorder. Most people were responding to different parts of the same crisis. A resident wanted to walk a child to school without passing someone who appeared unconscious. An outreach worker wanted that unconscious person to remain alive. Both concerns were reasonable. Fentanyl made it harder to separate them because overdose could occur so quickly. When an opioid enters the body, it can slow the brain's control of breathing. In an overdose, breathing may become shallow, irregular, or stop. Without oxygen, brain injury and death can follow. Naloxone blocks opioid receptors temporarily and can reverse an overdose. It does not produce intoxication, and giving it to someone who is not experiencing an opioid overdose generally will not create the harmful effect people sometimes fear. With fentanyl, more than one dose may be needed, and emergency medical care remains important, because naloxone can wear off while the opioid is still active. The CDC identifies naloxone as an effective way to reverse overdoses involving fentanyl and other opioids. In Kensington, naloxone moved beyond hospitals and ambulances. People who used drugs carried it. Outreach organizations distributed it. Family members learned how to administer it. Police officers, librarians, transit workers, store employees and residents became part of an informal emergency system. Someone would notice that a person's lips were turning blue or grey. Another person would call for help. A dose of naloxone would be given. Rescue breathing might begin. The person could wake confused, frightened or angry, because the medication had abruptly removed the opioid effect and brought withdrawal. Then daily life resumed around them. A train passed overhead. A delivery truck tried to reach the curb. Someone swept the entrance of a store. A child looked from a passing car. The person who had nearly died might refuse transport to a hospital, use again later, or ask for treatment that was not immediately available. A reversal prevented one death. It did not remove physical dependence, homelessness, trauma, or the drug supply waiting on the next block. This is why residents could witness dozens of rescues without seeing the neighbourhood improve. Overdose prevention kept people alive, which was essential, but it was only one part of what was needed. Treatment had to be available when a person was ready. Housing had to exist for those leaving the street. Wounds and infections required care. Mental illness and trauma could not be treated during a brief encounter on a sidewalk. Legal income had to compete with the money available through drug sales. Medication treatment offered one of the strongest tools. Methadone and buprenorphine can reduce cravings, prevent withdrawal, lower the use of illegal opioids, and reduce the risk of death. They do not simply replace one intoxication with another when used properly. They stabilize opioid receptors and allow many patients to return to work, family responsibilities, and ordinary routines. Access remained difficult. Methadone treatment in the United States was heavily regulated and commonly required frequent visits to specialized clinics. Buprenorphine could be prescribed in medical offices, but not every provider offered it. Waiting lists, identification requirements, transportation, insurance problems, fear of withdrawal, and previous negative treatment experiences created obstacles. Some treatment programs demanded abstinence from substances other than opioids. A person stabilized on medication could lose services after using cocaine or another drug. Programs sometimes discharged patients for the symptoms of the disorder they were supposed to treat. The Kensington market waited outside these systems with few forms to complete. Fentanyl also changed treatment itself. Its high potency and its movement through body tissues could make the transition onto buprenorphine more complicated for some patients. If buprenorphine was started at the wrong time, it could trigger sudden withdrawal. Clinicians developed different induction strategies, but practice varied and not every provider had experience with the changing supply. While health systems adjusted, deaths climbed. The CDC describes the national opioid epidemic as occurring in 3 broad waves. The first was driven by prescription opioids beginning in the 1990s. The second involved rapidly increasing heroin deaths around 2010. The third began around 2013 with sharp growth in deaths involving synthetic opioids especially illegally manufactured fentanyl and its analogues. Philadelphia followed that national progression, but the burden was highly visible in Kensington. In 2017, the city cleared a large encampment along the Conrail railroad tracks in North Philadelphia, an area that had become known for drug use and temporary shelters. People were displaced from the site, but the underlying market and need for shelter did not disappear. Many moved into nearby streets, tunnels, vacant properties, or other encampments. The clearing demonstrated a recurring difficulty. Closing a location could improve conditions at that specific site. It could also spread people into surrounding blocks if housing, treatment, and long-term support were not available. Residents near the next location then inherited the same problems. Philadelphia launched the Resilience Project in 2018 and declared the opioid crisis a public health emergency. City departments coordinated sanitation, outreach, public safety, treatment, and neighborhood services. Streets were cleaned, encampments closed, and people were offered shelter or assistance. Some conditions improved temporarily, others shifted. The market adapted faster than large institutions. Sellers changed corners, buyers followed information passed by word of mouth. People without housing moved to new spaces. A city department could remove debris in the morning and find new debris by evening because the activity producing it remained. The scale of mortality kept growing. Philadelphia recorded 1,276 unintentional overdose deaths in 2021. In 2022, the number exceeded 1,400, the highest annual total then recorded by the city. Most of the deaths involved fentanyl, frequently combined with other substances. The crisis was not confined to Kensington. Overdose deaths occurred throughout Philadelphia and increasingly affected Black and Latino communities, as well as the white users emphasized in earlier coverage. City officials repeatedly warned that fentanyl had spread across the drug supply. Kensington remained the public symbol because suffering was concentrated and visible there. Television crews and online creators filmed the same few corridors. Some reports examined policy and history. Others used residents and people with addiction as shocking images. Videos were given titles suggesting that viewers were entering a place outside ordinary civilization. A camera could record a person bent over at the waist without showing how he arrived there. It could not show the work injury years earlier, the prescription that ended, the first heroin purchase, the eviction, the family members who had searched for him, the treatment program he left, or the overdose he had already survived. Nor could it show the homeowner behind the camera's position, watching another stranger record the block and leave. The image of people standing in unusual positions became even more common as xylazine entered Philadelphia's opioid supply. Xylazine is a sedative and pain reliever used in veterinary medicine. It is not approved for human use. By the early 2020s, it was being found frequently in Philadelphia's fentanyl supply, often without the user knowing the exact contents. The combination became known widely as tranq. Xylazine does not respond to naloxone because it is not an opioid. Naloxone should still be given during a suspected overdose because fentanyl or another opioid is usually present, but the sedative effects of xylazine may continue after the opioid component is reversed. The substance can produce prolonged sedation and is associated with serious skin wounds. These wounds do not always appear only at injection sites. They may become deep, infected, and difficult to manage, especially for a person living outdoors without clean water, dressings, nutrition, or a safe place to rest. Philadelphia identified xylazine in a growing share of fatal overdoses. In 2021, it was found in 34% of all city overdose deaths, and in 44% of deaths involving fentanyl. In 2022, it again appeared in 34% of all overdose deaths, almost always alongside fentanyl. The wounds created a new barrier to treatment and housing. A person could want to enter a program but be rejected because the facility was not equipped to provide wound care. A shelter could have rules or physical arrangements that made dressing changes difficult. Hospitals treated infections and discharged patients who had nowhere clean to continue recovery. Some wounds became so severe that amputation was discussed or required. Outreach teams began carrying more than naloxone. They brought bandages, saline, medical supplies, food, water, and information about treatment. Nurses and community health workers cleaned wounds on sidewalks or in temporary clinics, because waiting for people to enter ordinary medical settings meant that many would receive no care. This work saved limbs and lives. It also placed a large burden on small organisations operating in conditions created by failures across healthcare, housing, criminal justice, and economic policy. Residents continued to live beside the response. Sanitation crews collected syringes and discarded packaging. Police made arrests. Outreach workers distributed supplies. Ambulances transported overdose patients. Treatment providers searched for beds. Neighbourhood organisations attended meetings where agencies presented new plans. The volume of activity could create the appearance of progress without producing a stable street. One reason was that each system measured success differently. Police counted arrests and seizures. Health agencies counted naloxone kits and treatment referrals. Sanitation crews counted tons of debris removed. Outreach programs counted contacts. Hospitals counted admissions and discharges. A family living on the block measured whether its front step was usable. The continued presence of the market led to arguments about supervised consumption sites, where people could use previously obtained drugs under observation and receive rapid overdose response. Supporters argued that such facilities could prevent deaths, reduce public use, and connect people with treatment. Opponents feared that a site would draw more drug activity, burden surrounding residents, or make an unacceptable condition permanent. Philadelphia became part of a national legal and political fight over the proposal. The debate revealed the lack of trust created by decades of promises. Kensington residents had often been asked to accept programs serving the entire region, while other neighbourhoods resisted hosting them. People in wealthier areas could support compassionate policy in principle, and still expect Kensington to provide the physical location. The neighbourhood had become the place where the city stored problems it could not solve elsewhere. Homelessness, untreated mental illness, poverty, addiction, and illegal drug distribution were concentrated around residents who had fewer political and economic resources to force their removal. This concentration made services necessary, but adding more services without reducing the market could leave residents feeling that the crisis was being managed rather than ended. Enforcement alone could not end it either. Fentanyl was easy to move in small quantities. Arresting street sellers did not eliminate the organisations above them. A person selling packets might be replaced within hours. Some sellers were themselves dependent on drugs or operating under coercion. Others used violence and profited substantially. Treating every participant as identical made policy less effective. The buyers kept arriving because dependents did not disappear when a corner was cleared. The product kept arriving because the profit remained. Fentanyl changed Kensington by making every weakness in the existing system more urgent. Housing instability became more dangerous because using alone in an abandoned building increased overdose risk. Gaps in treatment became fatal because the supply was less predictable. Delays in emergency response mattered more. A relapse after a period of abstinence became especially dangerous because tolerance had fallen while the street product remained potent. It also erased the idea that experience made drug use safe. A long-time user could die. A first-time user could die. A person using cocaine could encounter fentanyl unexpectedly. Someone taking a counterfeit tablet made to resemble oxycodone or alprazolam could receive a substance never prescribed by any doctor. Fentanyl cannot reliably be detected by seeing, tasting or smelling a product, and counterfeit pills may look convincingly pharmaceutical. By the early 2020s, heroin had largely stopped being the central substance in Philadelphia's opioid market. People still use the word heroin, but much of what was sold contained fentanyl, xylazine, or other ingredients. The traditional plant-derived drug had been replaced by a synthetic and constantly changing supply. That change did not remain fixed. New analogues and sedatives appeared. In 2024, Philadelphia's medical examiner began detecting medetomidine, another veterinary sedative, in overdose deaths. Fentanyl remained present in 93% of the city's opioid-involved overdose deaths that year, while xylazine was detected in 34% of all overdose deaths. The numbers eventually showed some improvement. Philadelphia's overdose deaths declined in 2023 and again in 2024, part of a broader national reduction. That decline represented lives not lost and should not be dismissed. It did not restore the people who had already died or remove the visible crisis from Kensington. The neighbourhood still carried the physical evidence. Vacant industrial buildings had become shelters for people with nowhere else to go. Streets built for factory workers now received ambulances and outreach vans. The elevated railway that once carried labourers to jobs carried customers to an illegal market. Row houses remained occupied beside lots where the industrial economy had disappeared decades earlier. Fentanyl did not choose Kensington. People made decisions about factories, housing, lending, healthcare, policing, treatment, and where public burdens would be allowed to gather. Fentanyl entered the conditions produced by those decisions and made them harder to ignore. The powder changed almost everything about the drug supply, but it did not erase the people living around it. Residents continued raising families, maintaining homes, opening businesses, organising meetings, cleaning sidewalks, and demanding that outsiders stop treating their neighbourhood as a spectacle. Some of the most important work was being done by people whose names rarely appeared in national reports. The person carrying naloxone for strangers, the nurse cleaning a wound, the shopkeeper calling an ambulance, the mother searching shelters, the resident collecting syringes before children walked past, and the person in recovery returning to the same streets to help someone else leave. Their presence complicates any claim that Kensington has simply been lost. The people who remained in Kensington did not spend every morning thinking of themselves as resilient. They woke because an alarm sounded, a child needed breakfast, a dog had to be taken outside, or a shift was about to begin. They checked whether the car had been broken into. They looked through the front window before opening the door. Some swept wrappers and discarded drug packaging from the pavement. Others used tongs to lift a syringe from beside a step and place it into a container where a child could not reach it. Then they went on with the day. The language used to describe struggling neighbourhoods often turns ordinary residents into symbols. They become survivors, activists, victims, or heroes. Many Kensington residents have been all of those things at different times, but they have also been people trying to complete errands and pay bills. Their persistence did not always take the form of a public campaign. Sometimes it meant refusing to abandon a house that had belonged to the family for decades. Sometimes it meant opening a shop after another difficult night. Sometimes it meant keeping a child involved in school, sports, church, music or work when the streets offered easier ways to disappear. National coverage of Kensington rarely began with these routines. A reporter arriving for several hours could find visible evidence of the opioid crisis without difficulty. The camera could follow Kensington Avenue beneath the elevated railway, stop near an encampment, or record outreach workers responding to an overdose. Those scenes mattered, but the frame often ended before reaching the occupied row houses nearby. Behind those doors lived people who had watched the neighbourhood change through more than one crisis. Older residents remembered factories, crowded commercial streets, and relatives who returned from work with oil, dust or dye on their clothing. They remembered when the drug market was smaller, when abandoned buildings were still active workplaces, or when children used spaces that later became associated with public drug use. Puerto Rican families remembered arriving in a city where discrimination limited housing and employment. Black families remembered similar barriers. White ethnic families who stayed after deindustrialization remembered relatives moving to the suburbs while they remained near familiar churches, houses and neighbours. Their memories did not always agree. One resident might describe an earlier Kensington as orderly and close-knit. Another might remember racial hostility, industrial pollution, domestic violence, or poverty hidden behind closed doors. Nostalgia could soften the past, but it also preserved a real difference. The neighbourhood once had more workers moving through its streets, more stores depending on local wages, and more buildings occupied for productive use. The people who stayed had to maintain community institutions after the economic structure supporting them weakened. Churches played a major role. Some congregations had roots in the old immigrant parishes created when Irish, Polish, German, Italian and other European workers settled near the mills. Later churches served Puerto Rican, black and increasingly diverse populations. Their membership changed, but their buildings remained places where residents could obtain food, clothing, counselling, funeral assistance and information. A church did not need to call its work an opioid response to become part of one. A pastor took a call from a parent whose daughter had disappeared. Volunteers prepared meals for people living outdoors. A congregation paid for a burial after an overdose. A church basement hosted a recovery meeting. Someone who distrusted government agencies might still speak honestly with a priest, minister, deacon, or volunteer known through the neighbourhood. Religious organisations could also disagree about harm reduction. Some viewed syringe distribution or supervised consumption as necessary ways to prevent death. Others believed these practices allowed drug use to continue or brought additional disorder near homes and businesses. The arguments were often intense because everyone involved could point to real suffering. A person distributing sterile syringes had seen infections, HIV, hepatitis and wounds caused by unsafe use. A resident opposing a nearby distribution site had seen discarded syringes near a school or front step. Neither person needed to be indifferent to the other. They were responding to different consequences of the same market. Prevention point. Philadelphia became one of the best-known harm reduction organisations operating in Kensington. Its work grew from the AIDS crisis, when activists began providing sterile syringes despite legal and political resistance. The organisation later expanded services to include overdose prevention, medical care, meals, mail access, housing assistance and connections to treatment. Its Kensington location became a point of contact for people who might otherwise avoid traditional institutions. The people using those services were not only receiving help, many became part of the emergency response themselves. Someone who used opioids could recognise an overdose faster than a passerby. People learned to administer naloxone, perform rescue breathing and call for emergency assistance. They warned one another when a particularly strong batch appeared. They shared information about treatment openings and dangerous cellars. Research conducted in Kensington has repeatedly treated people who use drugs as potential overdose responders, because many have already reversed overdoses among friends or strangers. One study recruited participants through Prevention Point, Angels in Motion, and Street Outreach, reflecting how community organisations and people with direct experience had become central to survival in the neighbourhood. This did not make the streets safe. It meant that formal emergency systems were being supplemented by people carrying naloxone in backpacks and pockets. Angels in Motion began with a similarly direct form of contact. Volunteers brought food, clothing, toiletries, and conversation to people living outside. The supplies mattered, but so did the practice of addressing people by name. Addiction and homelessness often reduce a person's public identity to what others can see. A volunteer returning each week could remember a birthday, ask about a missing relative, notice a worsening wound, or recognise that someone was finally ready to discuss treatment. Readiness was difficult to predict. Families sometimes spent years offering help that was refused. Then, on an ordinary morning, the person asked for treatment. The opportunity could be lost if no bed was available, identification was missing, transportation failed, or the programme would not accept the person's medical needs. Outreach workers learned that a successful conversation did not always produce an immediate entrance into treatment. Trust might develop over dozens of encounters. A person who had been robbed, arrested, discharged, rejected, or mistreated by institutions did not necessarily believe a promise made by someone wearing an identification badge. The worker returned anyway. This repeated contact became especially important as xylazine-related wounds spread. Mobile medical teams began treating people in vans, recreational vehicles, and temporary spaces near where they lived. A study of mobile opioid care units in Philadelphia found that most operated in Kensington, offering combinations of wound care, harm reduction supplies, testing, medication treatment, and referrals. Some vehicles contained examination rooms and laboratory equipment. Others functioned as smaller outreach units. A mobile clinic represented an acknowledgement that ordinary healthcare arrangements were not reaching everyone. A person with an infected wound might avoid a hospital because of withdrawal, previous stigma, fear of losing belongings, or concern that a partner would disappear. A clinic that arrived nearby reduced some of those barriers. Medical workers could clean wounds, provide antibiotics when appropriate, discuss treatment, and establish enough trust for a later hospital visit. The work was practical and often repetitive. Bandages were removed, wounds were examined, supplies were replaced. A person was reminded to return. The nurse understood that the dressing might become dirty before the next visit, because the patient had no clean room in which to recover. The city eventually created formal structures to coordinate these efforts. Philadelphia declared the opioid crisis a public health emergency in 2018 and established the Philadelphia Resilience Project, bringing together dozens of municipal offices. When that project ended in 2019, the city created a permanent overdose response unit in 2020, later organised as the Division of Overdose Response. Its strategy included community support, overdose prevention, public safety and treatment access. Residents had reason to welcome coordination and reason to distrust it. Kensington had experienced many announcements. Officials held press conferences, announced clean-ups, closed encampments, increased patrols, and promised treatment access. Conditions sometimes improved on a specific block, only to worsen nearby. A program could end when a grant expired. A new administration could change priorities. Community meetings collected comments that residents did not always see reflected in later decisions. The city's Resilience Project reported significant work during 2018 and 2019. It coordinated the closure of major encampments, added emergency and long-term housing opportunities, removed abandoned vehicles, installed syringe disposal boxes, and organised street cleaning and large volunteer cleanups. The city also acknowledged that hundreds of people remained outside after the major encampments were cleared. That final fact explained much of the frustration. Removing an encampment could eliminate dangerous conditions at one site, but people without housing still had to go somewhere. Treatment beds did not always match the need. Temporary placements ended. Couples did not want to separate. People with pets, belongings, active drug use, psychiatric conditions, or serious wounds could be excluded from certain programs. Kensington residents watched people move from tunnels and rail corridors into smaller groups on residential streets. The city had completed an operation. The neighbourhood had received a relocation. Residents began demanding a greater role in decisions about money and programs. They argued that large institutions often received funding, while small organisations with close community relationships struggled to survive. A neighbourhood group might know which families needed food, which block needed lighting, or which youth programme could keep teenagers engaged, but it might lack professional grant writers and administrative staff. The Kensington Community Resilience Fund attempted to address this imbalance through participatory grant-making. Residents and local leaders helped determine funding priorities, and a panel composed entirely of residents reviewed applications. In its first round in 2021, the fund distributed $200,000 in grants to 20 organisations serving Kensington, Harrogate, and Fairhill. Recipients included youth programs, community farms, food projects, arts groups, civic associations, faith organisations, and groups assisting people returning from incarceration. The list showed that responding to the opioid crisis required more than addiction treatment. A soccer club could be part of the response. So could a neighbourhood farm, a theatre company, a food hub, a photography programme, or a youth organisation. These groups did not reverse overdoses directly, but they strengthened the conditions that made a neighbourhood livable. They gave children somewhere to go after school. They placed trusted adults in their lives. They created spaces not organised around drug sales or emergency response. They helped residents experience the neighbourhood as something other than a crisis zone. Kensington Soccer Club, for example, used sports as a way to bring young people and families together. A child who practiced several afternoons each week had a schedule, teammates, coaches, and a reason to imagine progress. The programme could not eliminate poverty or remove the drug market, but it could create a dependable part of life within those conditions. Community gardens and farms performed another kind of repair. Vacant lots had become one of the clearest physical signs of abandonment. They collected trash, weeds, and illegal dumping. Transforming a lot into a garden changed who used the land and how neighbours viewed it. Residents built planting beds, grew food, and created a reason to watch over the space. A garden did not restore a factory or stop fentanyl trafficking. It reclaimed several thousand square feet from neglect. That scale mattered because neighbourhood decline had also occurred one property at a time. Local businesses performed similar work without always receiving public recognition. A shopkeeper who opened daily kept lights on and placed another set of eyes on the street. A restaurant hired residents. A barber or hairdresser heard local concerns before they reached a government meeting. A mechanic, grocer, baker, or pharmacist became part of the neighbourhood's information network. Operating a business near an open-air drug market involved costs that customers from other areas might never consider. Employees needed to arrive safely. Deliveries could be obstructed. Insurance costs rose. Customers avoided certain hours. Owners cleaned human waste, syringes, and discarded packaging from entrances. Some installed gates, cameras, brighter lighting, or reinforced doors. They also faced moral decisions. Should a person apparently overdosing be allowed to remain inside until help arrived? Should an employee administer naloxone? Should a bathroom be closed because drug use had occurred there, even though other customers needed it? When should police be called? What would happen to the person after an ambulance left? There was no simple policy that resolved every case. Schools carried another part of the burden. Teachers and staff worked with children who had encountered addiction at home or on the street. Some had lost parents, siblings, cousins, or neighbours to overdose. Others lived with relatives because a parent could not care for them. A child might arrive tired after a night of household instability and still be expected to complete assignments. Schools offered meals, counselling, structure, and adult attention, but they could not separate themselves completely from the surrounding environment. Routes to school passed through blocks affected by public drug use. Parents demanded safer sidewalks and stronger enforcement. Crossing guards and school employees became observers of the crisis because they stood in the same places every morning. Youth organisations filled gaps after the school day ended. Boxing gyms, sports programmes, churches, arts groups and recreation centres offered activities that were ordinary in most neighbourhoods and protective in Kensington. Rock Ministries became one visible example. Founded in Kensington, it combined a boxing gym, youth programmes, religious outreach, food distribution, and services for residents and people experiencing homelessness or addiction. A teenager could enter because of boxing rather than because he wanted counselling. Relationships formed through training, discipline, and repeated attendance. The coach did not need to begin by asking a child to describe trauma. He could begin by teaching footwork. Women frequently led the less visible work of holding families together. Grandmothers cared for children whose parents were absent, incarcerated, in treatment, or dead. Mothers searched hospitals and morgues. Sisters answered calls for money while trying not to support continued drug use. Partners carried naloxone and slept lightly because breathing could change during the night. family members entered their own form of recovery, even when the person using drugs did not. They attended support groups, learned about overdose prevention, established boundaries, and dealt with guilt. They asked whether giving money had prolonged the problem or prevented something worse. They wondered whether forcing a relative from the house had protected younger children or pushed the person closer to death. There was rarely a decision that felt completely right. Funeral directors, clergy and cemetery workers saw the consequences when families could no longer keep someone alive. An overdose death often left questions that complicated grief. Relatives replayed the last conversation. They questioned whether treatment had been available, whether naloxone was used in time, or whether the person had known fentanyl was present. Some families responded by joining advocacy and outreach. They distributed naloxone in memory of a child. They spoke publicly about addiction. They pressed schools to provide education, or asked lawmakers to improve treatment. Others remained private because stigma continued. An obituary might avoid mentioning overdose. A family told acquaintances that the death was sudden. Parents feared being judged for a condition they had tried for years to manage. People in recovery became some of Kensington's most important workers. They knew the language of the street and the experience of withdrawal. They could recognise excuses because they had used the same ones. They also understood that confrontation alone rarely produced lasting change. A recovery specialist might meet someone immediately after an overdose. The person could be frightened and temporarily willing to accept help. The specialist tried to turn that brief opening into transportation, admission, medication, or shelter before withdrawal and fear closed it again. Their own histories gave them credibility, but the work carried risks. Returning repeatedly to places associated with past use could trigger cravings or memories. Watching people die reminded them how easily their own recovery might have ended differently. They continued because they could say something that a clinician without the same experience could not say with equal force. "I have been where you are." That statement did not guarantee trust, but it made trust possible. City policy increasingly recognized the value of trusted community messengers. Philadelphia used door-to-door canvassing to provide residents with treatment information, naloxone and fentanyl test strips. By late 2023, city-supported canvassers had knocked on more than 22,000 doors, distributed thousands of naloxone doses and test strip sets, and trained local messengers to share overdose prevention information. A door-to-door approach reversed the usual direction of services. Residents did not need to find an agency or attend a meeting. Someone came to the house. A parent could ask questions privately. A resident who believed overdose had nothing to do with the household could still accept naloxone for an emergency on the block. The conversation also reminded people that overdose was not limited to those visibly using drugs on Kensington Avenue. Counterfeit pills and fentanyl-contaminated substances created risks in homes throughout the city. By 2026, Philadelphia's own list of Kensington resources included mental health providers, recovery services, youth organisations, housing programs, community centres, arts programs, food support, workforce services, and neighbourhood groups. The range reflected the city's recognition that Kensington was not merely a site of drug use. It was a community with children, families, workers, artists, immigrants, elderly residents, and people attempting to rebuild their lives. No directory could show how difficult it remained to reach the correct service at the correct time. A number might go unanswered. A program could be full. A family might not meet eligibility requirements. Transportation could fail. The person asking for help could change his mind. Outreach staff could spend hours arranging a placement only to discover that a wound, medication, criminal charge, or missing document prevented admission. This was why the people who never left became so important. They carried knowledge that could not be created by a temporary operation. They knew which block flooded, which landlord neglected repairs, which store allowed someone to use the phone, and which resident would hold a package for a neighbour. They knew which young person needed work, which family had lost someone, and which abandoned property had become dangerous. Their knowledge did not appear on most maps. It was passed through conversations on steps, in church halls, at school gates, inside shops, and during community meetings that continued long after television crews had gone. They were not united around one solution. Some demanded stronger policing and removal of services they believed attracted public drug use. Some demanded expanded harm reduction and housing. Some wanted every available approach used at once. Their disagreements could be severe because the stakes were not theoretical. They were arguing about the streets outside their homes. Yet the argument itself showed that Kensington had not been abandoned by everyone. People still believed the neighbourhood was worth fighting over. They objected to being told that decline was inevitable. They rejected the idea that compassion for people with addiction required accepting unsafe conditions indefinitely. They also rejected the idea that public order could be restored simply by moving sick and homeless people out of view. Their work continued in tasks too small to become national news. A meal was served, a wound was dressed, a child attended practice, a syringe was removed, an overdose was reversed, a vacant lot was planted. A person entered treatment and remained there for one night, then 1 week, then 1 year. These actions did not return Kensington to its industrial past, and most residents did not expect them to. The factory whistles would not begin again. The neighbourhood needed an economy, housing system, health response, and public life suited to the present. The question was whether rebuilding could occur without removing the people who had preserved the community through its worst years. New investment had begun reaching parts of Greater Kensington, bringing renovated buildings, restaurants, apartments, and rising property values. For some residents, that development offered the first serious sign of recovery after decades of abandonment. For others, it created the possibility that they would endure the years of crisis only to be priced out when conditions improved. The people who never left now faced a different danger. Kensington might be repaired around them rather than with them. The danger was not only that long-time residents might be forced out after the neighbourhood improved, it was also possible that improvement would be defined without asking them what they needed. A developer could point to a renovated warehouse and call it progress. A police official could point to fewer people gathered on one block. A health department could report more treatment referrals. A sanitation crew could count bags of trash removed. Each result might be valuable, but none alone could show whether Kensington had become a better place to live. The person who had remained through decades of factory closures, abandoned properties, drug markets, and public neglect might use a different measure. Can a child walk to school safely? Can a resident enter a home without stepping around drug packaging? Can a person with an addiction receive treatment on the day it is requested? Can a tenant remain after the building's repaired? Can someone find work that pays enough to live nearby? Can an older homeowner afford taxes, utilities, and maintenance? Can a person leaving treatment find housing that does not return them immediately to the same street where they purchased drugs? These questions make recovery more difficult to measure, but they also make it more honest. A neighbourhood is not restored simply because its worst conditions become less visible. People experiencing addiction can be moved from a commercial corridor into side streets, transit stations, hospitals, jails, or distant shelters. An encampment can be cleared without ending homelessness. Dealers can be pushed from one intersection to another. A vacant factory can become expensive apartments, while the family living across the street remains unable to repair its roof. Real recovery requires several systems to improve at the same time. Kensington needs public safety, because residents should not have to live beside organised drug sales, violence, and exploitation. It needs treatment because arresting people with severe substance use disorders does not remove the condition driving their behaviour. It needs housing because recovery is difficult when a person sleeps outside or moves repeatedly between shelters. It needs medical care because fentanyl, xylazine, medetomidine, infections, wounds, and chronic disease do not disappear when someone enters a program. It needs schools, jobs, parks, shops, transportation, and functioning public spaces because a neighbourhood cannot organise its future around emergency response alone. Philadelphia has repeatedly tried to combine some of these approaches. In May 2024, the city cleared an encampment along the 3,000 and 3,100 blocks of Kensington Avenue after a month of outreach. Officials reported that 59 people accepted housing, care or treatment during the process. Outreach teams continued working in the area afterward. The operation removed tents and large gatherings from those blocks, but it also renewed an old argument about what happens after a visible encampment is closed. Supporters said residents deserved usable sidewalks, and that people living outside needed to be moved into safer settings. Critics warned that clearing public space without enough permanent housing and long-term care would scatter people into surrounding areas. Both outcomes could occur. A person might accept a placement and begin treatment. Another might leave before admission. Someone could enter temporary housing and later return to the street. A person who refused assistance might move several blocks away. A block could become cleaner, while a nearby transit station became more crowded. The difficulty was not evidence that nothing should be done. It showed that an operation needed a longer system behind it. Treatment could not be treated as a single doorway. A person using fentanyl and veterinary sedatives might need medically supervised withdrawal, wound care, psychiatric treatment, medication for opioid use disorder, identification documents, benefits, and housing. A program prepared to provide only one of those services might reject the person because the remaining needs were too complicated. The patient could then appear unwilling to accept help, when the actual problem was that the available help did not fit the condition. Philadelphia has supported warm handoff programs intended to connect people seen in emergency departments with continuing treatment. The city has also pursued a 24-hour treatment centre and coordinated work through its Division of Overdose Response, which organises its strategy around community support, prevention, public safety, and treatment. The idea behind a warm handoff is straightforward. A person who survives an overdose should not simply receive naloxone, regain consciousness, and leave with a telephone number. A worker should help move that person directly toward treatment while the opportunity remains open. Carrying out that idea is harder. The person may wake in withdrawal and want to leave immediately. A treatment provider may have no bed. The patient may fear losing belongings left outdoors. A partner may not be allowed to enter the same program. The hospital may need the emergency bed for someone else. The person may agree to treatment at noon and change course by the time transportation arrives. A successful system must expect these complications rather than use them as reasons to give up. Medication treatment remains one of the clearest ways to reduce the risk of death. Methadone and buprenorphine can stabilise people who would otherwise spend much of each day avoiding withdrawal. The medication does not repair every part of life, but it can make repair possible. A person who is not searching for fentanyl every few hours has more opportunity to attend appointments, reconnect with family, obtain documents, work, and sleep. Treatment also needs to allow for imperfect progress. Someone may stop using fentanyl but continue using cocaine. A person may enter treatment several times before remaining. Another may leave a program, return to use, survive an overdose, and try again. A system that treats every recurrence as proof of failure misunderstands a disorder that is often chronic and relapsing. The same patient rarely appears in public conversations about neighbourhood safety. Residents have already waited for decades. They should not be told that they must accept dangerous conditions indefinitely because recovery takes time. A functioning policy must protect the person with addiction without abandoning the person living beside the market. That requires attention to the organised business of drug sales. People who sell fentanyl do not all occupy the same position. Some are low-level workers making small amounts of money. Some sell to support their own use. Others manage territory, recruit workers, carry weapons, and profit from a large regional customer base. Effective enforcement has to distinguish between them. Arresting a person for possession may interrupt treatment and housing without weakening the larger supply network. Targeting violent organisations, illegal firearms, trafficking structures, and properties repeatedly used for sales can have a different effect. Even then, enforcement must be maintained. A corner cleared for 1 week can reopen when police attention moves elsewhere. Residents often describe this cycle with understandable exhaustion. A public operation begins, officers appear in greater numbers, streets become quieter, cameras record the change. Several weeks later, sellers return gradually, and residents are expected to report the same activity again. Trust declines when government action arrives as a temporary event rather than a normal standard. Kensington also needs the ordinary services that better resourced neighbourhoods expect without an emergency declaration. Streetlights need to work. Illegal dumping needs to be removed. Abandoned buildings need to be secured. Parks need staff and maintenance. Public transportation needs to be safe. Housing inspections need to lead to repairs rather than paperwork that tenants cannot enforce. These services are less dramatic than an encampment closure, but their absence creates the spaces in which disorder grows. A dark vacant property can conceal sales and violence. A neglected lot signals that no one is responsible for the land. A broken streetlight changes how residents use a block after sunset. A store that closes leaves fewer people watching the sidewalk. Small failures accumulate in the same way industrial decline accumulated. Repair can also accumulate. A house is stabilised, a lot is cleaned, a business receives support, a playground is reopened, a young person is hired, a treatment patient remains housed. None of these events transforms the neighbourhood alone, but together they can change the direction of a block. Money from national opioid settlements has created one opportunity to support that work. States and cities have received funds from legal settlements, with pharmaceutical manufacturers, distributors, and other companies connected to the opioid crisis. Philadelphia has used part of its funding for community grants and overdose response programs. In 2025, the city announced a $3.6 million grant fund for organisations serving communities heavily affected by overdose, including Kensington and North Philadelphia. The Kensington Community Resilience Fund also entered its 5th year of resident-led grant-making, with a $360,000 round planned for community organisations addressing the effects of the crisis. The sums are meaningful to small organisations, but they remain modest compared with the damage accumulated over decades. A youth programme may use a grant to hire staff and serve more children. A neighbourhood group may clean lots, distribute food, organise arts programmes, or support families affected by overdose. Those activities can strengthen local life immediately. The danger is that temporary grants may disappear before the need does. A community organisation can spend months building trust, hire several residents, and begin a successful programme. When the grant period ends, staff are laid off and participants lose another dependable institution. Funding systems often reward new projects more easily than the maintenance of existing work. Kensington has had enough experiments that vanish when outside attention shifts. Long-term planning has therefore become important. The Co-Creating Kensington initiative has argued for a comprehensive neighbourhood plan developed with residents rather than a collection of unrelated interventions. The process emphasises Kensington's existing strengths, including transportation, housing stock, civic groups, and a large number of small businesses. The need for a comprehensive plan sounds obvious, but urban policy often operates through separate departments. The housing agency considers buildings. The health department considers overdose. Police consider crime. Transportation officials consider streets. Economic development groups consider businesses. Schools consider students. Each office has its own budget, authority, and measurements. Residents experience all of them together. A mother walking a child to school does not divide the journey into public health, sanitation, transportation, and law enforcement. she experiences one sidewalk. A person leaving treatment does not experience housing, employment and medicine as separate policy categories. They are parts of one attempt to remain stable. A neighbourhood plan can help agencies understand these connections, but only if the plan influences actual spending and decisions. Community meetings by themselves do not create power. Residents have attended many meetings where they described the same concerns, watched officials take notes, and saw little change. Participation must mean more than being allowed to speak. Residents need access to information about budgets, property acquisition, zoning, treatment facilities, enforcement strategies, and redevelopment proposals before decisions are final. They need ways to hold agencies responsible for promises. Small neighbourhood organisations need enough administrative support to compete for funding without becoming professional bureaucracies. The question of redevelopment makes that local control especially important. Parts of Greater Kensington have already attracted substantial investment. Former industrial buildings have become apartments, studios, offices, breweries, restaurants, and event spaces. New houses have appeared on vacant land. Proximity to centre city and public transportation has made the area attractive to residents, priced out of more expensive neighbourhoods. Investment can reverse some consequences of abandonment. A vacant mill is repaired instead of demolished. A polluted industrial property is cleaned. New residents support shops. Tax revenue increases. More people use the streets, and political pressure for services grows. A building that once symbolised lost employment can become active again. The benefits are real. So are the risks. A renter may welcome the repaired building next door and then receive a rent increase when the lease ends. A homeowner may gain property value but struggle with higher assessments and taxes. A small business serving long-time residents may lose its lease to a business targeting wealthier customers. A family may sell because the offer seems generous, then discover that it cannot afford another home nearby. Displacement does not always occur through an official eviction. It can happen when rent rises gradually, when a landlord stops making repairs to push out a tenant, when property taxes increase, when a building is converted, or when everyday expenses rise with the changing commercial market. It can also occur culturally as long-time residents begin to feel that new businesses, public spaces and political attention are intended for someone else. Kensington has already experienced one period when investment left. Residents should not have to leave when investment returns. Policies intended to prevent that outcome include affordable housing requirements, assistance for low-income homeowners, property tax relief, tenant legal support, community land trusts, and the preservation of existing affordable homes. Each tool addresses only part of the problem. A community land trust can acquire land and keep housing affordable by separating ownership of the building from ownership of the land. Tax relief programs can help qualifying homeowners remain in properties whose value has increased. Repair grants can prevent an older owner from selling because the house has become unsafe. Legal representation can help tenants challenge unlawful eviction. The timing matters. Once property values rise sharply, preserving affordability becomes much more expensive. The city and community organisations need to secure land and protect residents before speculation reaches every block. Vacant land should not be viewed only as a future opportunity for outside developers. It can support affordable housing, parks, gardens, small businesses, health facilities and community ownership. Decisions about that land will determine whether recovery strengthens the existing neighbourhood or replaces it. Jobs are equally important. Kensington cannot recreate the textile economy that once employed tens of thousands of people, and it should not try to reproduce the pollution, dangerous machinery, child labour, or low wages that accompanied it. The useful lesson from the industrial period is not that factories were automatically good. It is that stable employment close to home supported many other parts of neighbourhood life. Modern work could include construction, building maintenance, healthcare, logistics, food production, green infrastructure, education, transportation, skilled trades, and small manufacturing. Training programs need to lead to actual paid positions rather than certificates for jobs that do not exist. Residents with criminal records or gaps in employment need a realistic path into that economy. A person returning from incarceration may be denied work and housing, increasing the chance of returning to illegal income. Someone in recovery may need flexible scheduling for treatment. A young adult who has watched relatives survive through informal work may need a paid apprenticeship rather than another lecture about making better choices. Public investment can require contractors to hire locally, but requirements must be enforced. A company should not be allowed to list positions that residents cannot access and then claim that no qualified workers were available. Recovery also depends on how Philadelphia responds to the changing drug supply. The fall in overdose deaths offers a reason for cautious hope. Philadelphia recorded 1,069 unintentional overdose deaths in 2024, an 18% decline from 2023, and a 24% decline from the record high in 2022. Fentanyl remained present in 93% of opioid-involved deaths, and the 19134 zip code, which includes much of Kensington, recorded 179 deaths, the highest number in the city. Xylazine appeared in 34% of all overdose deaths, while the newer veterinary sedative medetomidine appeared in 92 deaths after the medical examiner began testing for it in May 2024. A decline from an extreme level is not the end of the emergency. 1,069 deaths in a year still represent nearly 3 deaths each day across Philadelphia. The concentration in 19134 shows that Kensington continues to carry a disproportionate burden even as overdose mortality improves citywide. The changing combinations of fentanyl, cocaine, xylazine, midatomidine and other substances also mean that yesterday's treatment and emergency practices may not fit tomorrow's supply. Health workers need current drug checking information. Hospitals need protocols for severe withdrawal and wounds. Treatment programs need the ability to accept people with complex medical conditions. Public information needs to reach people who do not identify as opioid users. In 2024, half of Philadelphia's overdose deaths involved both opioids and stimulants. Stimulant-only deaths increased even while overall deaths declined. A person using cocaine may need naloxone nearby because fentanyl can be present, and the cardiovascular risks of stimulants require attention of their own. This is one reason a neighbourhood cannot be found again by returning to a previous version of itself. Kensington before fentanyl still had heroin, poverty, vacancy and racial inequality. Kensington before deindustrialization had dangerous factories, long hours, pollution and unstable wages. Kensington before the factories existed on land taken from Lenape people through colonial expansion. Every earlier version contained both community and harm. The goal cannot be to recover an imaginary period when everything worked. It must be to build conditions that did not exist fully in the past. Safe streets without mass abandonment, effective treatment without humiliation, investment without displacement, employment without exploitation, and public order that does not depend on hiding people who are sick. No single mayor, police commissioner, hospital, non-profit organisation, or neighbourhood group can produce that result. Government must provide resources and enforce standards. Health systems must treat addiction as a medical condition. Police must address violence and organise sales without becoming the only institution asked to respond. Developers must be required to contribute to housing and neighbourhood needs. Treatment providers must make room for people whose recovery is not immediate or orderly. Residents must have power in decisions, not simply responsibility for cleaning up afterward. The rest of Philadelphia also has a role. Kensington's drug market has served customers from across the city and region. Treatment facilities, supportive housing and harm reduction services cannot remain concentrated in one neighbourhood because other communities refuse them. Every district that sends people to Kensington to purchase drugs shares responsibility for creating places where those people can receive care close to home. The neighbourhood should not remain the region's waiting room for suffering. Finding Kensington again would begin with recognising that it was never completely gone. It remained in the residents sweeping a step before sunrise. It remained in the coach opening a gym, the nurse cleaning a wound, the teacher greeting a tired child, and the shopkeeper lifting a gate. It remained in the person carrying naloxone for a stranger, and in the person entering treatment for the 5th time. It remained in every family that buried someone and still answered the next call for help. Those people preserved enough of the neighbourhood for recovery to remain possible. The work ahead is not to rescue an empty place. It is to support a living one. The elevated train will continue passing above Kensington Avenue. Some passengers will look down and see only the conditions that made the neighbourhood famous. Others may notice the row houses, churches, shops, schools, murals, gardens, and people moving through another ordinary day. History changes what that view means. The abandoned buildings are no longer random ruins. They are remains of an economy that once organised the neighbourhood. The drug market is no longer evidence that one community failed. It is the result of decisions made across medicine, industry, housing, finance, law enforcement, and government. The residents are no longer background figures in a story about fentanyl. They are the people who lived through the consequences and will determine whether renewal becomes another form of removal. Kensington can be found again, but not by searching for the neighbourhood that existed before the crisis. It will be found in the one that people are still building now,